Oh, brother. Why? Why do you guys keep doing that? Oh my god, that just got me too.
Number 3. My dad has been an MTA
Oh,
Transit
fuck.
subway station manager for 35 years. With this job, there has to be a manager on duty at all times, so he's practically done every single possible shift throughout his career. That means he's done his fair share of night shifts. Most trains were completely empty throughout the night. He said it was the only nice part about doing the night shift. He has a series of funny and weird night shift stories to tell, but there's one downright horrifying one. My dad had just boarded the train to move to his office at another station. He was alone when he got on, which was at about 3 in the morning. At the next station, someone boarded. My dad describes him as a white, tall and skinny man wearing a heavy jacket and beanie. He shot my dad a quick glance before sitting in the furthest corner away from him. My dad said that he felt uncomfortable as the guy kept looking up at him every so often. When my dad's stop came, he got off, as well as the other man. He walked to his office door, unlocked it, and looked behind him. The man in the jacket was pacing around only about 50 feet away. My dad stepped into his office, shut the door, locked it, and sat at his desk. 5 minutes later, someone started to try and turn the doorknob. After the
Trying to get
person on
used
the
to
other
this
side of the door
setup I
realized
have
it was
now.
locked, they started to knock softly. My dad called out, "Who is it?" And they responded, "I want to talk."
No.
He told whoever it was to go away. He said he knew trouble when he saw it. He had a good feeling it was the guy from the train, as this station at a time like this was apparently always completely empty. My dad told the guy to go away. He continued to knock for a good 5 minutes. My dad finally pulled up the security camera screens and brought up the camera pointed to his office door. Sure enough, there was the guy from the train, wearing the jacket and beanie. Coincidentally, as soon as my dad brought up the camera, the man walked away. So my dad did whatever his work consisted of for about half an hour in that office. Before leaving to catch the next train, he checked the camera to make sure that the weird guy wasn't out there. He locked up and walked down the stairs to the train platform, where he got on the train right away. Looking out the window, he saw the guy from before walking down the stairs to the platform, and then stepping on the train into the same car as my dad. He sat down on the opposite side, a few seats to the right. My dad tried to look away and pretend not to notice him, but he knew the guy was staring at him. He at one point gave in and stared back, giving a slight nod and smile in some sort of truce attempt, before looking away again. The man stared at my dad the whole ride to the next station, but my dad never looked back at him once after the first time. Now you may be asking, why didn't he try to forcibly get the guy to back off? Well, despite my dad's intimidating size, he's always been a complete teddy
Excuse me.
bear. No bark and no bite. Plus, he says he feared that that guy was armed, and that one small motion could lead to death. When the train stopped at the station, my dad practically ran all the way back up to the streets, constantly glancing over his shoulder. And yes, the man from the train was following him. My dad had to find the first public building still open to try and escape. He found a Wendy's that was open and stepped inside. He sat and watched as the guy following him walked up to the window, stopped, and stared my dad down through the glass for about 10 seconds before turning around and walking across the street and then down the sidewalks. My dad said he ate, waited a little longer, then left the Wendy's to get to his third and final station for the night. The scariest part, when my dad was in his third office, as he was checking the security cameras out of the paranoia of the situation, he caught the guy from the train pacing around the outside, only about 30 feet from his office. He then stopped, looked up at the camera, and according to my dad, literally froze and stared for no less than a minute. When he finally lowered his head, he walked away out of the station to never be seen by my dad again. My dad doesn't know if he was followed after leaving the Wendy's, but that would only make sense. The guy was clearly disturbed, possibly homeless and or dangerous, and who knows what he actually wanted with my dad. Number 2. Me and my 3 friends were in New York around Christmas time. We didn't finally decide to leave until about maybe 2 in the morning. We got on the first train that we could catch, and as expected, it was empty. We were pretty sobered up by then. Then there was a sudden commotion in the next car over. We had peeked through the glass in between the cars, and there were
they move fast.
teenagers standing obnoxiously close to a woman sitting in one of the seats who was screaming for help. I suggested that we go over and kick their asses, but as me and a buddy got a closer look, we saw they were armed with handguns. I pushed all my friends to get to the next car over, away from the armed men. I took a look back and saw one of the men pointing at us before starting to follow. We ran through at least 3 different cars with the men following us before the train finally stopped at the next station. We all booked it through the old station to the nearest place we could hide. I got separated from my friends, so I went to hide behind a garbage can. I could hear my chasers' shoes.
I gotta buy a
floors,
protector
so I
for
knew I
this
had no
thing.
time to find a better hiding spot.
No, like a
I
matte
peeked
finish.
through the opening
So
at the top of the bin. I
slippery.
could get a better look at them now. One was black, the other was Indian, and they were both really young looking. I was sure they were only trying to rob us, until I heard one of them say, "If you find them, kill them." I hope you understand why I almost gave away my position in reaction to hearing this. With a gasp and almost pulling the garbage bin down with me as I returned to cover, I consider it a miracle neither of them caught me. They left the area. I took notice that they didn't have their guns drawn at that moment. I ran in the opposite direction of the two and quickly caught my friends who were waving me over from behind a large pole. I took cover with them behind another pole not far from that one, and we waited for as long as we thought necessary. The big shock to this story, though, was when we caught glimpse of the woman from the train, who we thought was being threatened by the 2 men, walking over in the direction of the men and then calling something along the lines of, "Where are they? Don't tell me you didn't get them." The 2 men reappeared from beyond a corner, walking over to the woman. The rest of what they said was too low to pick up on. They walked back down the stairs to the platforms, and as we could guess, waited for another train to run their trap again. At the very least, we called the police and reported what was going on, but I have no idea if they were ever caught. Number 1. My name is Danny, I'm 22 years old, and this was the most horrifying experience of my life. I live and work in New York City, but I don't have a car, so my main mode of transportation is the subway. It was a Saturday night. I was on my way home from a party in the middle of the night. I did this about every other weekend, so I was completely fine with taking the subway alone at night. Walking down the steps, entering the underground without a soul in sight, it was always a bit chilling. This specific station was very tightly spaced. As I was walking, I could almost feel as if I were being watched or followed, along with the occasional echoing bang-type sound emitting from an unknown location. I was early for the train, so I sat on the bench and
What
waited.
kind of photo is this?
This is something straight out of a horror movie. I heard this exact phrase. "Psst, over here, buddy." There was somebody standing on the tracks in the tunnel, poking his head out and looking at me. It was a filthy looking man, I'd say in his early 40s. He gave me a smile, a horrible yellow smile with at least 3 teeth missing, and I could tell that even from where I was sitting. I did the best I could to pay no attention to him, but he wouldn't go away. There was laughing coming from inside the tunnel, and then another disgusting looking man stuck his face out as well.
Oh, is this the
man
one with
gave me a
the
nasty smile as well, before telling me to come hang out with them in the tunnel. The way they
cut
stared at me,
head?
though, their eyes wouldn't even move. It's as if their sight was locked onto me. I resumed doing the best I could to ignore them and just wait for the train. I noticed in my peripheral vision that one of the men moved away into the tunnel, returning moments later with another face. I had to look again. There was a third face, but this one was hunched over and lifeless. It looked like one of the men were holding the guy's face up. The sound of the train approaching felt like 1,000 pounds off my shoulders. I got up ready to board the train, but when I got closer to the edge of the platform, I nearly threw up at the sight. The two men were going back into the tunnel, but the second man in the back was holding something in his hand. A head. Just a head. Like a decapitated head. They disappeared from sight onto the side of the tunnel. As the train stopped, I got into the first car, planning on warning the conductor, but no later than after we left the station. I didn't want to be there a second longer. As the train began to move, I saw legs moving down the stairs to the platform, but that was it. I didn't get to see who it was, but what I did get to see, as the train moved into the tunnels, I caught a glimpse of a group of men, hunched up against the railing, inches away from the train window, and they were all looking right at me. I knocked on the conductor's door like a madman, screaming it was an emergency. He opened up and I explained what I just saw. He radioed to somebody in charge of the station, as well as another higher-up of the company, who I'm sure took care of it, or contacted the proper authorities or security, whatever. It seemed to take ages for my stop to come, but when it did, I practically had to hop in my walk from relief. I have since been to one party at the same friend's house, but I skipped that station. I decided it was worth it to take the extra long walk to the next station. I don't know if weird shit happens often in the subway at night.
Yes.
Experience prior to this incident, it never did. But after this experience, I think I should say you should be extremely cautious when in an isolated place like a subway station late at night.
My leg is actually wrong. Leg should be more like this. How long is this post? Fucked it up a lot, but give up. That's a long post. Actually, I'm gonna take a break for a sec. Get my pizza. Pizza.
It was 2022. I was living in the Bay Area at the time, Oakland specifically, and I'd driven up to visit my parents in Eureka for the weekend. If you've never driven Highway 101 along the Northern California coast, it's beautiful during the day and kind of a nightmare at night. Like long stretches with no other cars, no cell service, barely any lights, kind of ominous really. I left my parents' place around 8 p.m. on a Sunday, which was stupid in hindsight. I should have just stayed the night and driven back Monday morning, but I had an early shift and figured I'd rather just knock out the drive. Famous last words, I guess. The first couple hours were fine. The stretch I was on had narrowed down to a 2-lane road at that point. That's how most of rural 101 is once you get north of the bay. It was somewhere around Trinidad when the fog started rolling in. Fog on that part of the coast isn't unusual, but this was different. Within maybe 5 minutes, it went from clear visibility to barely being able to see 20 feet ahead of my car. It was actually really bad, worse than I'm describing. I slowed down to maybe 35 and kept going. The smart thing would have been to pull off and wait it out, but there's really not a lot of places to stop on that stretch. And honestly, I just wanted to get home. I figured if I took it slow, I'd be fine. Here's the thing about fog that thick though, and any California driver knows this, but it messes with your sense of space. You can't see landmarks, you can't tell how far you've gone, you can't see what's coming up ahead. It's disorienting as hell, especially when you're already tired. After another half hour or so of driving, I saw a figure standing off the side of the road. I say figure because that's genuinely what it looked like at first. Just a shape on the shoulder, maybe 50 feet ahead. As I got closer, I could see it was a person, a guy based on how tall it was, and he was just standing there facing the road. He wasn't walking or waving me down like he needed a lift, and it didn't look like he was on the phone either. He was genuinely just standing there. I slowed down even more as I passed because I was worried about clipping him if he stepped out into the road. He didn't move though. He didn't even turn his head to watch my car go by, which was really creepy. I got a good look at him as I passed, and there was nothing about his face that struck me as particularly unusual. My first thought was maybe his car broke down somewhere and he was waiting for a ride, which would make sense, right? Except I hadn't passed any cars on the shoulder. There was no reason for him to be standing in that exact spot, facing that exact direction. There was nothing there. I thought about turning around to ask if he needed help, but something about the whole thing felt wrong. It wasn't my problem, so I just kept driving. About 10 minutes later, though, I saw him again. I'm not exaggerating, it was the same guy. Same build, same dark clothes, same stance on the shoulder. The only difference was that this time he was on the left side instead of the right, but everything else was identical. I actually said what the hell audibly out loud to myself, because there was no way this guy could have gotten ahead of me. I was the only car on the road, and there weren't any cross streets or shortcuts or anything like that. The only explanation was that it was a different person who just happened to look exactly like the first guy and was standing in exactly the same weird way. I didn't want to look at him as I passed, but I couldn't help myself. I had to confirm whether it was the same guy, and after getting a good look, I was dead certain it was. But this time, the guy actually locked eyes with me as I passed, and I couldn't look away fast enough. Seeing his head snap to my eyes was really freaky, and I instantly regretted making eye contact. I sped up a little, not a lot, because the fog was still thick and I wasn't trying to drive off the road, but I sped up enough that I was pushing 45. I wanted distance between me and whatever the hell was going on back there. The fog got even worse after that though. I could barely see the center line at that point, so I really had no choice but to slow back down. I was having trouble thinking straight, which I attributed to the mixed effect of how tired I was, how hard it was to drive, and what I had just seen. I kept trying to rationalize it, but I couldn't. My train of thought was interrupted though, because not 3 minutes later, my headlights exposed something ahead. There was another person up there, only this time he was standing in the middle of the road. I had no choice but to stop, which is exactly what I did. This time he was wearing a hood that was covering his face, so I couldn't see what exactly he looked like, but I had a feeling it was the same guy. He once again didn't move, which is when I started really getting scared. We were at a standstill, and even though I couldn't see his face, I could feel him looking at me. I didn't know what to do. I flashed my brights at him a few times, trying to get him to move out of the way or at the very least react, but he didn't. I put the car in reverse, and when I looked in my rearview mirror, I nearly died. There was someone behind me. There was a person back there, creeping towards my car. I yelled, "Holy shit," and put the car back in drive. I was boxed in, but I didn't care. There was an actual threat on my life now. I pulled hard to the right, crossing into the opposite lane to get around the guy blocking the road ahead. The guy didn't, and I thought I was in the clear. But then something hit my car from behind. It wasn't just a light tap. It was violent. The whole back end of my car jolted to the right, and I heard this awful crunching sound, like metal on metal. I maintained control of the car and kept driving, thinking I had gotten into an accident with another car. But when I checked my mirrors, there was nothing behind me. Nothing at all, not even those people. As if the situation wasn't already freaky enough, that made it so much worse. I wasn't waiting though. I sped off as fast as I was comfortable going with how heavy the fog was. By the time I hit the 101 interchange, I could actually see again, and for the first time, I felt my brain starting to relax. But the more I calmed down, the more I thought about what had happened. And this might sound surprising, but I genuinely concluded that I hallucinated everything. Here's the thing, I had been driving for almost 4 hours at that point. I was exhausted. I had been staring into fog for God knows
Whatever you gotta tell yourself, bro.
to see anything, completely alone on a dark highway. So an extremely vivid hallucination didn't seem that far-fetched to me. Why it was so oddly specific was beyond me, but there was no other explanation for me having seen those people or having felt a wreck that didn't actually happen. By the time I made it home, I was just ready to sleep the whole thing off and try to forget about it. But then I walked around to the back of my car. The rear bumper was destroyed. There was a massive dent running almost the entire width of it, which meant whatever hit
Oh my god. Trying to find.
It also meant that I actually had been hit, meaning I hadn't hallucinated anything. I stared at the dent for like 5 minutes. There wasn't any paint transfer, which there definitely would have been if I had been hit by another car. But if it wasn't another car that had hit me, I have no idea what could have caused such considerable damage. I did end up calling the cops to report what I saw, but it was more so just to get the info out there. I've thought about that night a lot over the past 4 years. I've gone through every possible explanation I could think of. What I've accepted is that I hallucinated the figures, and in my panicked attempt to drive off, I hit a guardrail post or a mile marker or something like that. The thing that gets me is this though. I can accept a hallucination, but for me to hallucinate one thing, the figures, while actually experiencing the other, the crash, is something I have trouble accepting. The fact that there was actually damage to my car has always made me think there was something more malicious going on that night.
Excuse me.
This happened this past spring break, so we're talking only a few weeks ago. I'm still in college, I'm a senior now, and I went back to my hometown for the week like I always do. The problem with going home, though, is that there's genuinely nothing to do there. I grew up in one of those suburban towns that's technically close to a city, but doesn't have any of the benefits of actually being in one, meaning no bars or nightlife or anything really within walking distance. When I'm at school, I've always got something going on, but back at home, it's a ghost town. The other issue is that none of my hometown friends have the same spring break schedule as me. I've got maybe 4 or 5 people I still keep in touch with from high school, and every single one of them was either still in class or already had their spring break earlier in March. So I was looking at a full week of doing nothing, which I really wasn't thrilled about. I should probably also mention that I've been trying to cut back on some stuff lately, nicotine and alcohol mainly. I figured a week at home with nothing to do was either going to make that worse or give me a chance to reset. I decided I was going to work out every single day instead. I was going to lift in the mornings and run in the afternoons, keep myself busy just so I could stay out of my own head. That's how I ended up going for a run on a random Tuesday afternoon. I remembered this loop I used to do back when I ran cross country in high school. It's exactly 3 miles from start to finish, starting and ending at my house. The route takes me through my neighborhood for maybe a quarter mile, then cuts into this wooded trail that winds through a small patch of forest before spitting you back out onto the street about a block from home. I've probably run that loop 1,000 times between freshman and senior year. The woods is the best part, honestly. Running on pavement destroys your knees, but the trail through the woods is soft. It's quiet in there too, which is something I always look for on my runs. So I headed out around 5.
Excuse me?
The sun wasn't going to set for another couple hours, so I wasn't worried about visibility. What I did notice though, and I noticed it the second I stepped outside, was the fog. I don't know how to describe it other than to say it was thick in a way I'd never seen before. I've lived in that town my whole life, and I don't remember fog like that. It looked fake almost. Like I was in some ambient video game or one of those lo-fi YouTube videos with the anime girl studying.
Oh, damn.
Everything past maybe 30 or 40 feet just dissolved into haze. I thought about skipping the run, but I talked myself out
So
of it.
black.
The trail through the woods is a straight shot. One path with no forks or diverging paths. I've been through there so many times I could probably do it blindfolded. Getting lost wasn't even a possibility. I had my Garmin watch on so I could track my pace and distance. I started my workout, did the quarter-mile through the neighborhood, and entered the woods. The fog was even thicker in there, which made sense since the trees blocked out a lot of the remaining daylight. I couldn't see more than 15 or 20 feet ahead of me, but the trail is easy to follow. For the first mile and a half, everything was normal. I was running a little slower than usual because of the visibility, but it wasn't too bad. I remember checking my watch around the mile mark, then again at a mile and a half. The issue started around the 2.5 mile mark. At that point in the loop, I should have been approaching the end of the trail. The path curves to the left, you go up a small hill, and then you're out, back on pavement. I know that section by heart. Hell, I know every section by heart. I've literally run that loop hundreds of times. But when I looked down at my watch and saw 2.5 miles, I was still deep in the woods. I figured my watch was just being weird. It was at least 4 years old at that point, so I assumed its GPS signal was getting interrupted by the dense tree coverage or something. The fog could have been messing with it too. These seemed like reasonable enough explanations though, so I just kept running, assuming I wasn't as far along the trail as I thought. But then I passed 3 miles, which was when I knew something was up. 3 miles is the entire loop. At 3 miles, I should have been standing either in my driveway or on the street. Instead, I was still surrounded by trees on both sides, still running on the same dirt path with no indication that I was anywhere close to getting out. So I stopped. I'm not a paranoid person, and I'm not superstitious either. There must have been some rational explanation for what was going on. I caught my breath and tried to think, but I genuinely could not figure out what was going on. There was only one trail, which I knew for a fact. There weren't any forks, branches, or alternate paths. The only way I could have gotten lost in there was if I had physically left the path and waded through the brush and undergrowth, which I definitely hadn't done. I checked my watch again. 3.1 miles. The number kept ticking up even though I was standing still. The GPS was definitely having issues. That was the only part of the whole thing that made any sense. I didn't really have a choice at that point. I could either keep running forward and hope I eventually hit the exit, or I could turn around and retrace my steps. The second option seemed smarter. If I just ran back the way I came, I'd eventually get to the trailhead where I started, and from there, I knew exactly how to get home. So that's what I did. I turned around and started running back. The fog had gotten worse. I didn't know how that was even possible, but it had. I had to slow my pace just to make sure I didn't run off the trail by accident. After about a mile of running, so about 4 total miles at that point, I heard something. Like I said earlier, it's usually dead quiet in the woods, which I suspect is the case because it's too small for a lot of animals to inhabit. So hearing a sound out there was something my brain wasn't prepared for, but the sound itself was so much worse. It was something I'd never heard before. The closest I can get to describing it is a moan, but that's not quite right. It was lower than more like a drone, and it fluctuated. Then dipped back down, then swept. It's like a siren, but human. I can't overstate how wrong it sounded. It didn't really sound like someone in pain either. Quavering noise that didn't seem to have any purpose. I started running faster, but you have to remember that I had been running for over 4 miles at that point. I could only go so fast, and the exhaustion only made the situation that much more terrifying.
Sit down.
Running faster only tired me out more. and the more tired I got, the more scared I got. The sound didn't stop no matter how fast I ran. Whoever or whatever was out there was matching my speed. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, and I did multiple times, I couldn't see anything. There was just fog back there. I ran with the sound following me for what felt like forever. I had no other choice. It was the scariest moment of my life. After an eternity of running, I finally made it out of the woods. I ran into the street and nearly threw up out of exhaustion. The fog was still impossibly thick, even outside the woods. I turned around and looked back into the woods. To my horror, there was something standing right in the middle of the trail. Just a little ways beyond the trailhead. I say something because I don't know what else to call it. It was just a shape, this dark mass of a silhouette. It was way taller than me, and I'm 6'1". This thing had to be 7 feet tall at least. It wasn't moving closer or further away from me. It just watched me. I could feel it. If it weren't for the fact that it was gently swaying back and forth, I would have questioned whether I was looking at a tree or something. The droning sound had stopped, but I wasn't giving it another thought. I turned and ran home without looking back. That was a few weeks ago now. I'm back at school at this point, but I haven't been able to think about that night. I can't get that image of what I saw in the fog out of my head. That black mass and that god-awful sound. I told my parents about what I saw, obviously, and they both seemed convinced that it was just a tall person trying to scare me, or potentially attack me, which I guess is possible, but I don't believe that. How were they able to make that noise while running to keep up with me? Impossible. And how tall they were, too. I don't know what was in those woods that night, and I probably never will. This happened about 6 years ago, late September. My buddy Edwin and I had been talking about kayaking Willapa Bay for probably 2 years at that point, and we finally locked in a weekend to actually do it. If you're not familiar with the area, Willapa Bay is this massive tidal estuary on the Washington coast, something like 25 miles long. It's mostly oyster farms and wildlife refuge, and on a clear day, it's honestly one of the most peaceful places I've ever been. The weekend we picked was not a clear day. Neither of us were amateurs. We'd both been kayaking since we were kids, and Edwin actually worked as a guide for a few summers during college. We knew what we were doing. That's important context for what I'm about to tell you, because I don't want anyone thinking we were just a couple of idiots who got spooked because we didn't know how hot water and fog work. We launched early Saturday morning from a put-in spot near Nakota. The fog was really thick, but we figured it would burn off by mid-morning like it usually does on the coast. We had a GPS, a compass, and everything. The plan was to paddle out toward Long Island, maybe do some bird watching, have lunch on one of the sandbars, and head back before the afternoon tide shift. The first hour or so was fine. The fog muffled everything in that way coastal fog does. You feel like you're paddling through cotton and everything is really quiet. We couldn't see more than maybe 40 feet in any direction, but we were staying close together and checking our bearing every few minutes. No big deal. It was probably around 9 a.m. when I first heard something. It was a splashing sound. At first, I thought it was Edwin. We were paddling in loose tandem formation, him about 15 feet to my left, and I figured he just adjusted his stroke or something. But when I glanced over, his paddle was resting across his kayak. He asked if I heard that too, and I nodded my head yes. We both stopped paddling and just drifted there for a second, listening. It was the sound of oars, not paddles, which I say specifically because oars and paddles make distinct sounds. We were using paddles. You'd only use oars if you were on a different kind of boat, but it was definitely someone rowing a boat, and it didn't sound too far away from us either. Maybe 100 feet somewhere off to the right. Edwin said it was probably just someone else out there on the water, which seemed reasonable enough. There were other kayakers who used the bay, and occasionally you'd see fishermen in small boats checking crab pots. The fog was thick enough that we couldn't see them, but sound travels strangely over water, especially in fog. Sometimes things sound closer than they are, sometimes they sound further. We waited for a minute, expecting whoever it was to either call out or appear through the haze. Standard etiquette when visibility is low is to announce yourself and let other boaters know where you are. But the rowing just continued at the same steady pace. I suggested maybe they didn't know we were there, so Edwin said hello into the nothingness. But there was no response. In fact, whoever was in the other boat didn't even seem to notice, because the rowing sounds didn't speed up, slow down, or change at all. We started paddling again, figuring we'd either come across them or they'd pass by. But here's the thing, and I know this sounds paranoid, but over the next 20 minutes, that rowing sound never got any closer or further away. Hearing that same exact rhythm over and over again started getting intoxicating, and after a while, I was actually in awe of how perfectly someone could keep their stride for so long. But as time went past, I only got more and more freaked out. It was an unsettling situation, to say the least. Edwin and I really weren't talking much anymore, but I knew he felt the same way. At one point, we shifted our course slightly east, trying to angle toward the shore, and for a split second, the fog thinned out just enough for me to see a small rowboat sitting in the water. I could see the shape of someone at the oars, so I knew there was a person in it. But then the fog closed back in, and they were out of sight again. The whole glimpse lasted maybe 3 seconds. I asked Edwin if he'd seen it, and he said yes. At that point, I wanted to leave. Something about the whole situation was making me deeply uncomfortable, and I couldn't even fully articulate why. It's not like we'd seen anything threatening. It was just some guy rowing a boat, but the way he refused to identify himself or even acknowledge our presence, and the way he seemed to be following us, was just so creepy. I started heading for the shore, hoping Edwin would follow my lead, and he did. The problem was the fog. Even with the GPS, navigating the bay in low visibility isn't straightforward. There's sandbars that shift with the tides, shallow channels you can get stuck in, all sorts of nasty stuff. We knew roughly where we were, but roughly isn't the same as exactly, and the last thing we wanted was to beach ourselves on a mudflat while that other boat was still out there somewhere. We paddled southeast, moving as quickly as we could without exhausting ourselves. The rowing sound stayed with us the whole time. I kept glancing to my right, hoping to catch another glimpse through the fog, but I never did. And then, without any warning, the fog started to lift. It didn't clear completely, but it thinned enough that we could suddenly see maybe 100 yards in any direction. I immediately looked to my right, toward where the rowing sound had been coming from. There was nothing there. It was just open water. I looked behind us. Open water there too. I looked in every direction I could. I saw Edwin doing the same thing, but as far as we could tell, the bay was empty. I looked at Edwin and realized however freaked out I was, he was even more scared. I could see it in his eyes. We kept paddling, and even though the rowing sound had stopped and we could actually see now, the situation was a lot scarier. How could that boat have just disappeared like that? The shore came into view about 5 minutes later, and I was relieved. I thought the ordeal was finally over, but no. We paddled straight for land, not even bothering to look for a suitable landing spot. We hit the shallows, and I jumped out into knee-deep water. The water was cold as hell, but I barely noticed. I was just glad to be on solid ground again. For a minute or two, neither of us said anything. We just stood there on the beach catching our breath, looking out to the bay. The fog was still lifting, which was good, but there were still no boats anywhere out there. Edwin had wandered a little ways up the beach while I was securing my kayak. He told me to follow him, so I did. I realized he was looking at something, and I hurried to catch up to him, but the moment I noticed what he was looking at, I was terrified all over again. There were footsteps, wet, barefoot footsteps leading out of the water and up onto the sand. They were fresh, which was painfully obvious because you could see where water was still pooled in the depressions. Whoever made them had not been out of the water for long. But here's the thing. They didn't just lead up to the beach and stop. The prince came out of the water, walked a few feet up toward the tree line, and then turned and followed the shoreline to our left before eventually cutting back toward the trees and disappearing into the woods. I followed the path with my eyes, trying to trace it backward. The prints were coming from somewhere further down the shore. Whoever made them had seemingly walked up along the water's edge, come up onto the beach right where we'd landed, and then headed into the forest. Edwin was a few steps ahead of me. He said he wanted to leave, but I couldn't stop looking at the footprints. They were leading somewhere, or rather, they were coming from somewhere, and I wanted to know where. I told Edwin I wanted to follow them back, not into—
Yeah, you're fucking crazy,
I
bro.
wanted to see where they originated. He looked at me like I was out of my mind, which honestly, maybe I was. But something about this whole situation had been gnawing at me since we first heard those oars, and I wasn't ready to just paddle away without at least trying to understand what the hell was going on. Edwin didn't want to come back with me, but he also didn't want to stand there alone. So after about 30 seconds of back and forth, he reluctantly agreed. We started following those footprints down the shoreline. The fog still hadn't completely lifted, but the visibility was a lot better at that point. We walked for maybe 2 or 3 minutes, keeping the footprints to our left, and then I saw it. Maybe 50 yards down the beach, pulled up onto the sand at an angle, was a small wooden rowboat. The wood was dark, almost black, and the oars were resting inside it. It was the same boat, I was 100% certain of it. The shape, the color, the size, it was the exact same boat I'd seen through the fog when we were out on the water, and now it was here, on the shore, with a trail of wet footprints leading away from it. I started walking toward it instinctively, but Edwin grabbed my arm. He told me we were leaving, and he said he wasn't asking this time. He said he didn't care what was in the boat or who had been rowing it. We were done. Something about the way he said it took me from curious to downright terrified. Whoever had been in that boat had somehow gotten to shore before us, walked all the way down the beach to the exact spot where we had just happened to land, and then still had time to disappear into the trees. We turned around and started heading back toward the kayaks. Edwin was practically sprinting at that point, and seeing him run only freaked me out even more. We got to our kayaks, shoved them back into the water, and paddled out of there as fast as we could. And that was that. I've thought about that morning a lot over the past 6 years. I've gone through every possible explanation I could think of. The best case scenario,
Still don't like
just
to
victims
hear,
of some
but
elaborate prank, but I think that's somewhat far-fetched. Here's what I keep coming back to. We were on the water for over 2 hours. We paddled in multiple directions, changed course several times, and eventually made a beeline for shore when the fog started lifting. Whoever was in that rowboat would have had to get to land before us, in a slower vessel no less, walk all the way down the shoreline to the exact spot where we ended up landing, and then disappear into the trees. All before we even hit the beach. It sounds so absurd and impossible that I honestly don't know what to think. So that's why after I send this, I'm gonna try not to think about it once again.
oh, okay. Um,
being held. Probably the biggest one in the city, too.
excuse me.
Back in 2020, when the pandemic was still causing all kinds of chaos, I started driving for Uber to make ends meet. I was laid off from my retail job and needed quick income. The thing about rideshare gigs is you see all kinds of people, especially when you're working late nights like I was. There were awkward encounters, drunk passengers, weird conversations, but none of that compares to what happened one Friday night in October. It was a little after midnight, and I had just dropped someone off at a hotel near the outskirts of town. My app pinged almost immediately with a new request. The pickup location was about 6 minutes away, in front of a bowling alley that was part of a strip mall. Pretty standard stuff. The name on the ride said Derek. I accepted it and started heading over. The area
Probably will just like
just a few dim parking lot lights. No cars in sight, and the bowling alley looked
mirror this.
but there was a man standing alone under one of the lights, wearing a gray hoodie and jeans. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with his hands in his pockets, head down like he was looking at his shoes. As I pulled up, he looked at me, but didn't wave or move. I rolled down the window and said, "You Derek?" He nodded slowly, walked over, and got into the back seat behind me. I started the trip and asked him if the destination in the app was correct, an address about 20 minutes away in a residential neighborhood I'd never been to. He said, "Yeah, that's right," in a quiet, calm voice. I remember thinking he sounded a little off. Not drunk or high, just sort of flat,
Excuse me.
emotionless. But I didn't think too hard about it at the time. I started driving, and he didn't say anything for the next 5 or 6 minutes. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror now and then, and every time I looked, he was staring straight ahead. Not out the window or at his phone, just at the back of my head. I tried to break the silence by asking how his night was going. He paused, then said, "Just needed to get out of there." I asked, "Out of where?" He said, "Doesn't matter." So I didn't push it. We drove a while longer. About 15 minutes in, I realized we were getting closer to the destination, but the address was in a really isolated part of town. No streetlights, big yards, and lots of trees. As we approached the address, he suddenly leaned forward and said, "Actually, can you pull into that driveway right there?" He pointed to a house on the right. The house was dark, no lights on inside or out. It looked old and abandoned, honestly. It had an overgrown lawn and paint peeling on the siding. There was also no car in the driveway. I said, "Is this your place?" And he said, "Just pull in." I hesitated, but turned into the driveway. I stopped near the front of the house and put the car in park. He didn't get out. I looked back at him and said, "Everything all right?" He stared at the front door and said, "Wait here." Then he got out and started walking toward the house. He didn't go to the front door. He walked around the side of the building and disappeared from view. I sat there for maybe 2 minutes, trying to decide what to do. The ride was technically still going. I didn't want to drive off and get penalized, but I also felt like something wasn't right. My gut told me this guy wasn't just heading inside to grab something. Finally, I ended the trip manually. I marked it as complete and started to back out of the driveway, but before I could shift into reverse, I saw him walking back toward the car, fast. His hands were empty, and he had this strange look on his face, like he was angry or excited. I unlocked the doors because I didn't want to make it a confrontation, but something in me was screaming not to let him back in. He opened the rear door, got in, and said, "Take me to the other place." I asked, "What other place?" He said, "Just drive, I'll tell you." I said, "You need to put it in the app." He didn't answer. He just stared at me in the mirror. I said again, "I can't take you anywhere unless you put it in the app." He didn't say a word. After a few seconds, he told me to drive to where I picked him up. I didn't want to argue anymore, so I started heading back toward the strip mall. The whole way there, I felt this pressure in the car. He wasn't talking, but I could feel him watching me. The hairs on my arms were standing up. He was still staring at the back of my head. At one point, I tried to lighten the mood. I said, "Rough night?" He replied, "You could say that." I asked if everything's all right, and he said, "Not yet." I didn't ask any more questions. When we got back to the strip mall, I parked under the same light where I picked him up, but before I could say anything, he leaned forward and asked, "You ever wonder how you're gonna die?" I froze. I laughed awkwardly and said, "Not really something I think about." He didn't laugh. He just leaned back in his seat, and after a few seconds, he said, "I think about it all the time." Then he opened the door and got out without another word. He didn't close the door right away. He just stood there for a second, half in and half out of the car. Then he looked at me and said, "You picked the wrong guy up tonight." He shut the door and walked off into the darkness behind the bowling alley. I sat there for a minute, too shaken to move. Eventually, I drove home, constantly checking my mirrors. When I got home, I looked at the trip details again. Something was off. The name had changed. It no longer said Derek. It was blank. No name, no profile picture, no trip history. It was like the ride never happened. I contacted Uber support to report it, but they told me the trip data was unavailable. They said
What?
that happens if the app crashes or if the rider cancels midway. But I know what I saw. I know I completed the trip. I know the man got in and out of my car, and I know he said what he said. "You picked the wrong guy up tonight." I've never seen him again, and I hope I never do. But every time I get a ping in a dimly lit parking lot or have a silent passenger in the back seat, I remember that night. And I remember that feeling that something terrible could have happened. That maybe he changed his mind at the last second, or maybe he was never planning to do anything, just wanted to scare someone. but I still wonder what he meant, and if he ever found the right car. This happened in 2021 when I was driving for Uber full-time. I live in a city that gets a lot of tourists, especially in the summer, so rideshare gigs can be decent money if you're consistent. I worked mostly nights, partly because I'm a night owl, and partly because it's less traffic and better tips from drunk passengers coming back from bars. The night this happened, it was around 1:30 in the morning, a pretty normal Saturday night crowd.
Excuse me.
I had just dropped off a group of college kids who wouldn't stop yelling in the back of my car, so I was glad to get a request that looked quieter. The name said Chris, and the pickup location was a small side street just off downtown. The weird thing was, the pin was in kind of an odd area, not near any bars or apartments, more like near the lot of an old strip mall. But I figured maybe it was just a bad GPS marker. It happens sometimes. I drove over and saw a guy standing at the corner, hoodie on, jeans, staring down at his phone. I pulled up and said, "Chris?" He nodded and got in the back without saying much. He didn't smell like alcohol or slur his words. He seemed sober and just really quiet. He didn't say hello, nor did he answer when I asked how his night was going. Some people just aren't talkers, so I didn't think much of it. I started the ride, and the drop-off was on the opposite side of town, 25 minutes away, in a suburban neighborhood I'd been to maybe once or twice before. The thing was, it was dark out there, like no streetlights in some areas. Pretty isolated. I noticed about 5 minutes into the trip that Chris had his phone out, but he wasn't texting or calling anyone. He was holding it flat in his lap with the flashlight on, just shining the beam upward, slightly toward my seat. I asked him kind of half joking, "Everything all right back there?" He just mumbled, "Yeah," and then turned the flashlight off. The next 20 minutes were dead silent, just the hum of the engine and a weird tension building in the car. I don't know how to describe it. Something just felt off about this guy. Not threatening, but definitely unsettled, like he wasn't really there. We got to the neighborhood, and I followed the GPS to the house. But as we pulled up, I noticed it was totally dark. No porch light, no inside lights, nothing. I asked, "Is this the right place?" Chris didn't answer. He just sat there. I turned around and looked at him. I repeated myself a little louder, saying, "Hey, is this it?" He stared past me out the window. I repeated myself one more time, and finally he nodded. So I put the car in park and said, "Have a good night."
Get the fuck out.
He just sat there. So I asked again, "Are you good?" He finally reached for the handle and stepped out, but he didn't close the door. He just stood outside the car with the door open, facing the house. I sat there waiting. A few seconds passed, then 20, and then a full minute. I was just about to say something when he suddenly turned around, looked at me through the open door and said, "I need to go back." I blinked and said, "Back where?" He said, "Where you picked me up." His tone was flat with no emotion. I didn't know what to say. That was a 25-minute drive, and it wasn't like I could just reverse the trip. I told him he'd have to request a new ride, but he just stared at me. He begged me, saying, "Please, I need to go back." I told him
No.
again, "You need to request it through the app." That's when he said something that sent chills up my spine. He said, "I can't. They're not gone yet." My only response could be, "Who's not gone?" He didn't answer. He just stood there, still holding the door open, and I noticed he was breathing heavily. At that point, I started getting seriously uncomfortable. I said, "Look, I can't just start a new ride unless you request it." He stared for another second, then slowly backed away and closed the door. He walked toward the house, even though it was pitch black and looked empty. I waited until he got to the porch before I pulled off. The moment I turned the corner, I ended the trip in the app and started heading back toward downtown. A couple blocks down, I stopped at a 24-hour gas station to use the bathroom and get a drink. I parked at the side of the building, went inside, and came back out maybe 4 minutes.
I saw the motherfucker.
My car. I felt like my brain short-circuited. Chris was sitting in the back seat, same hoodie and same expression. I thought I had locked the doors before going inside, but somehow he was in the back of the car. I opened the driver's side door and stepped back in slowly, keeping my eye on him through the mirror. "How did you get back in?" I asked. He just said, "Take me back." I said, "I'm calling the cops," and reached for my phone. That's when he leaned forward, close enough for me to hear his breath, and said, "They're still in the house." I don't know why, but I didn't call the police. Something about the way he said that made me feel like he was having some kind of episode. I played along and said, "Whose house is that?" And he said, "My parents." I asked him if he lived there, and he said not anymore. That made the hairs stand up on my neck. I started slowly driving back to where I picked him up. Every part of me was screaming not to do it, but I didn't know what else to do. As we got closer, he started breathing heavier. He was rocking slightly in the back seat. At one point, he whispered, "They're still there. They won't leave, no matter what I do." When we pulled up to the house, there were still no lights, still no signs of anyone living there. He got out without saying anything and then walked up to the front door and stood there. He didn't knock or anything, he just stood still. I waited maybe 30 seconds, then pulled away again, making damn sure the doors were locked. I drove 3 blocks, parked under a streetlight, and sat there for 10 minutes trying to process what just happened. I debated calling the cops, but what would I even say? That a guy got into my car twice and said weird things? There was no crime technically as far as I knew, so I just drove home and didn't sleep that night. The next day, I reported the ride to Uber, and honestly, I regretted not reporting this to the police because the man might have been sick in the head needing help. I hope he didn't hurt anyone. Who knows if that house was even really his parents' house, or if he actually was just having a manic episode.
Do I like that?
I'm an 18-year-old girl that lives alone in my apartment with my dog. I live about 8 miles out of food delivered can be a hassle sometimes. I never thought anything of Uber Eats being bad. You may hear some stories, but never think they will happen to you. At least that's what I thought. It was Friday evening. I was cleaning my apartment, getting ready for my boyfriend to come over. We're on weekends, so I usually try to get it cleaned up before he arrives on Saturday. I had been cleaning for about 2 hours, and it was past 6 p.m., so I was feeling hungry. I didn't want to dirty any dishes.
What's
so
a
I just
dick?
cleaned them all and cleaned the kitchen. I decided to order food so I wouldn't have to make a mess. I ordered my food and got the notification that my driver was on his way and driving a white Honda Fit Sport. I'm a young girl living on my own, so I have my delivery instructions set to leave my order at my door for contactless delivery. I was sitting in my living room watching TV when I got the notification that my food was delivered. As soon as I got that notification, I jumped up, eager to get my food. I was starving. When I opened the door to grab my food, it wasn't there, so I thought maybe he set it at the wrong door. But looking down at all the doors, none of them had the food at them. So I went back in and was gonna message him when I heard a knock at my door. It was my next door neighbor. He was holding my food. He said, "Hey, sorry, I picked up your food from your delivery driver because he was looking through your windows and I wasn't sure what he was doing." I took the food and thanked him, wondering what the hell just happened. I went back in, ate my food, and enjoyed a movie when I started to get ready for bed. I took a shower, then went to turn off my TV and make sure all my doors were locked.
Wait, what happened to your boyfriend coming
Laid down in
over?
bed, called my boyfriend, and eventually ended up falling asleep. I woke up a few times during the night to my dog growling at the window or the back door. My dog isn't a huge, scary dog. He's a small 5-pound Morkie, but it's still pretty scary when he growls at something and catches you off guard. I finally got him to calm down and go back to sleep. It wasn't even 15 minutes later that I woke up to banging on my window. My dog started going crazy, barking, growling, and even whimpering. I couldn't move in my bed. I took the bed sheets and pulled them over my head, just leaving enough to not cover my eyes so I could see the window. I called the police and whispered into the phone quietly. I explained to the operator that someone is in my backyard and my window doesn't lock so it can easily be lifted up. She told me to go to a different room.
You don't
Police would be
think
at my
to
apartment shortly.
have that
I
fucking
ran to
shit?
my kitchen and grabbed a knife, just waiting to see blue and red lights or hear sirens. It felt like forever. I looked out the window of my kitchen and never expected to see what I saw. The Uber driver's car that delivered my food. His car was sitting across the street from my apartment. When you open the door to my apartment, there's a large open field to the left that's used for parking trailers and letting dogs play. He was parked there, but I didn't see anyone in the car. I put two and two together and thought to myself, he's in my backyard. The police finally arrived. I could barely even speak. I was shaking and crying. I explained to one officer what happened, while the other went to check out my backyard, which is where my bedroom window is. Another officer who arrived went to check his car because it was still in the field, but he wasn't in his car. The two officers came back and started talking with the officer I was speaking to, telling her there's footprints in my backyard, which it had just rained the night before, so it was very muddy outside. I started panicking once I heard that, not just because that's not what you want to hear, but also because where was this guy if he didn't come back arrested with the cops and wasn't in his car? My neighbor came outside to see what was going on. The officers explained to him what was happening. Then he spoke about how he picked up my food for me earlier that day. The neighbor invited me to sleep over at his apartment for the night if it made me feel any better. Oddly, I passed on the offer, and when all the cops left, I went back into my apartment. Thinking it was all over, I took a few hours to get comfortable enough to fall asleep. But at 2 a.m., I woke up to banging on my front door and heard police. There's no way this is happening right now, I thought to myself. I got up and went to my front door, scared to open it. It was the woman I spoke to earlier. She explained they stayed at my apartment, hidden to watch for that guy in case he showed back up, and he did. They caught him walking up to my front door, thinking he was going to try to find a way in. My heart fell to my stomach when I heard her say that. She then explained he was arrested, and I don't have to worry about him anymore. I thanked her and went back to try and sleep. Unfortunately, I couldn't fall asleep this time. I also don't use Uber Eats anymore when I'm home alone.
Excuse me.
I was 26 at the time, and I'm male. I was in Washington, D.C. on a sort of vacation, visiting my then fiancée. I'll call her Sarah for the sake of the story. I was visiting for a graduation she was having for her basic training. It was a big deal for her family, and she asked me to be there for it, so I said why not and booked the flight to be there. I'd be arriving about a week before the rest of her family, so she and I could have some time, just the two of us, before she had her family there for the occasion. She stayed with me at my hotel during this time, and eventually we decided we wanted to go and explore some of the nearby historical sites that Washington had to offer. I'd never been there, of course, so the idea piqued my interest, and we decided to do it. Once we arrived at our location, we spent about 4 hours walking around and seeing all the sights, from the Lincoln Memorial to the Washington Monument, the Congress Building, and even the White House. It really was a fun and exciting experience for myself to see all these places, as I had missed out on going on a school trip in high school to visit them.
Aww.
Sarah at the time seemed to appreciate my interest in them as well, and we really enjoyed ourselves. After we finally decided we had enough walking around and were ready to return to the hotel, we used the Uber app to call for a ride. We had used it earlier to arrive and had no issues, so we decided to just use it again for the ride back. Sarah made the request on her phone, while I sat down under some shade and waited. I was pretty tired from all the walking we did, and I could feel my body just ready to get back to the hotel for a long-needed nap. Eventually, after about 10 minutes of waiting, a car pulled up in front of us along the side of the road. Sarah motioned for me that this was the car, as the place they stopped at was not a parking spot or a place a car would just stop at on its own. I stood up and followed her to the car, where she opened the back door and stepped inside, asking the man, "Uber for Sarah?" And he gave a slight nod without saying anything. So I followed her into the car and shut the door behind me. Now looking back on this, I realized how stupid both her and myself were in doing this. We should have asked for the driver's name and verified the car was a match to the one on the app. I didn't have access to any of this myself, and she made the request on her phone, so it didn't really cross my mind at the time to do any of this. As we both sat in the back of the car, which was a gray-colored minivan, the driver didn't speak to us. I found this a bit odd, as any other driver I'd ever had would at the very least greet me once I entered or confirmed my name. But this guy, nothing. He started driving without acknowledging either of us, other than the nod he gave when Sarah asked him if he was our Uber. And I did pick up on how weird it was, but I was tired and didn't really feel like trying to engage with the man myself. I laid my head back and just closed my eyes. I then felt a tap on my arm from Sarah after what felt like only 5 minutes of the drive. I opened my eyes and looked at her, and she didn't speak to me. I could see the look on her face was one of worry, and it had me wondering what exactly she was concerned about. She then pointed to her phone, which was showing the route the Uber would take to drive us back to our hotel. It didn't take me long to realize that the way we were going was not the way the route had said.
This is not the way.
I could see Sarah's face drain with color shortly after when a notification popped up on her phone saying our Uber had arrived, followed by a message from the driver asking where we were. My heart sank into the pit of my stomach. It was then I realized how dumb I was by not verifying the car and driver before we just both stepped in. The picture that was on Sarah's phone within the app did not match the driver, and I knew we had gotten ourselves into a situation. I slowly looked back towards the driver, but I didn't say anything. I didn't know what this man's intentions were, or what he was capable of, and honestly, I didn't want to find out. I just knew at that moment, I had to get both Sarah and I out of that car. I leaned forward and told the man that we had changed our minds and would be fine just being let out where we were in an attempt to get us out of the situation without alarming the man of what we knew. He glanced at me through the rearview mirror in the first actual acknowledgement of us he had given since we stepped into the vehicle. I caught his glance as he stared at me without saying a word in what felt like minutes, but was probably only 10 seconds. He didn't stop the car though. He didn't even say a word in response to me, and just kept driving the car as if nothing had been said. My patience had run out, and I knew whatever this man had in store for us wasn't good. I then did the only thing I could think of at that moment, and reached into my pocket, pulling out my pocket knife. I flipped the blade out, and without wasting another second, I told the driver, "I know you're not our Uber driver. I don't know what your plan is here, or what you think you're about to do to us, but I have a knife, and if you don't pull this car over right now, I have no problem using it." The driver's eyes quickly looked at me again within the rearview mirror, and I knew he could see the knife gripped tightly in my hand. He quickly pulled the van over, and I heard the doors unlock. Sarah and I wasted no time in getting out of that car as fast as we could. The moment we were both out, the man sped off. We quickly took a moment to gather ourselves as Sarah was having a panic attack, and I myself was still wrapping my head around what the hell just happened. Sarah quickly pulled out her phone and responded to our actual Uber driver and informed him of our location and asked if he could come pick us up. The actual driver arrived within a few minutes, and this time we made sure it was the right one. We told him everything that had happened, and it was then that he informed us something that made the blood in my veins go cold. He told us there had been multiple instances recently where people were posing as Uber drivers in the area, as it was an easy way to find many tourists and people not from the area that wouldn't think twice about just getting into a car thinking it was a Lyft or Uber. Apparently, many people had gone missing, and they could only assume the worst. He told us both we were lucky we noticed when we did, and hadn't gotten further away from where we had been picked up, which was probably the only reason the man let us go, and of course the fact that I was armed. We made it back to the hotel without issue, and we quickly reported it to the police. We gave the best description of the man and the car that we both could, and the police told us they'd call us with any information they could find. We never heard back from them, so I assume the man was never caught or found, and that worries me that he could still be out there doing this to others. Again, I realized how stupid
I'm just gonna keep
we
it
were after all
simple.
this, not verifying whose car it was we were getting into. But let this be a reminder to everyone listening, do just that. Always verify your Uber drivers, and always make sure you're aware of your surroundings.
Times it. Two, 4. Oh, why is pencil so dark? What was I using before pencil? What was I using before? Chalk? I think it's using chalk. Yeah, kind of that way. It's gonna be me. It's gonna. I'm happy it's actually gotten colder again. I am not ready for the hot weather. Like I just bought like a Carhartt jacket. I'm like, I want to wear this. Like what? All right, I'm gonna be right back. I'm gonna eat some lasagna. Sorry. I shouldn't be yelling. Actually, I'm sorry. Sorry. I guess I'll put something on while I go prepare that.
Okay, so I used to work night shift at a small hotel, and this happened about a year ago. But I still think about it all the time because it genuinely freaked me out so bad, and I don't know what the guy's plan was or what he was trying to do. And it honestly makes me feel sick when I remember just how long he was there and that I didn't even realize he wasn't supposed to be there. The hotel was small, only 3 floors and maybe 40 rooms total. It wasn't a busy place. Usually we only had about 10 or 15 rooms filled on weeknights. I worked from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. It was usually really boring and quiet, which was fine with me. I would just sit behind the desk, do some paperwork, sometimes check the cameras, sometimes watch YouTube on my phone if it was really dead. The lobby wasn't big, just the desk and some couches off to the side with the TV, and then some vending machines in the corner. Behind the desk was a little office where I had a computer and a chair and a glass window so I could see the lobby while I sat in there. At night, the front doors locked automatically, so guests had to buzz in, and I would press a button to let them through. Usually nothing happened after midnight except the occasional guest coming in late. But one night, this man came in around 11, and everything about it still makes my stomach drop when I think about it. He buzzed the door and I let him in. He looked mid-40s, tall, kind of skinny, but not too skinny, and he was wearing jeans and a baseball cap, carrying a backpack. He walked up to the desk and asked if we had a room for the night. I told him yes and gave him the price, and he nodded and pulled out a card. I swiped it, it went through, and I gave him a key card for room 214 on the 2nd floor. I remember he looked at me for a second too long before he left. He had this kind of blank expression, and his eyes stayed on me for maybe 3 or 4 seconds after I handed him the key. Then he turned and walked off toward the elevator. Nothing about it screamed dangerous right away, but it was enough to make me notice him. After that, I sat back in the chair and played on my phone for a while. Around midnight, I looked up and he was back in the lobby. He didn't come to the desk, he just walked past me and sat down in the lounge area with the couches. The TV wasn't on, but he just sat down facing it. I figured maybe he couldn't sleep or something. Some guests hang out in the lobby sometimes, so I didn't think too much of it. But then after half an hour, I realized he was literally just sitting there doing nothing. He wasn't on his phone or reading. He wasn't even dozing off. He was just staring straight ahead at the blank screen. I got up at one point to grab water from the vending machine, and when I walked across the lobby, I felt him turn his head and watch me the whole way. I didn't look at him directly, but I could feel his eyes on me until I was back behind the desk. It gave me this really uneasy feeling. Around 1 a.m., I was checking the reservation system on the computer because I was bored, and that's when I noticed something weird. I pulled up the occupied room list and saw that room 214 said vacant. I mumbled what the f under my breath and double-checked, because I literally just checked this guy in an hour earlier. I thought maybe I made a mistake, so I looked at the check-in logs, and there was nothing for him. No name, no charge, nothing. Then I went into the transaction screen to make sure his card had gone through earlier, and it showed no payments. I remember feeling confused as hell, because I swore I swiped his card and it beeped like it worked, but there was nothing in the system at all. That's when I picked up the phone and called room 214. It rang like 10 times, but no answer. Then I checked the key card entry log, which tells you if the door to that room was open that night, and it showed nothing. No one had entered the room. That's when I realized he never even went to the room after I gave him the card. I looked over into the lounge, and there he was, still sitting there, staring at the TV that wasn't even on. I started to get this awful feeling in my chest. I sat there debating what to do. Part of me thought maybe the system just glitched, but the fact that the room had no entry log and no charge made it pretty clear he wasn't even checked in. I waited another 15 minutes just watching him. Around 1:30, I walked over and asked if everything was okay. He turned his head and looked at me with no expression, and he told me he just couldn't sleep. Then he turned back toward the TV. I nodded and went back behind my desk, but my hands were shaking. Around 2, I noticed he wasn't sitting in the lounge anymore. My stomach dropped right away because I didn't see him in the lobby at all. I scanned the area, and then I spotted him standing at the end of the hallway by the bathrooms, half hidden in the dark. He was just standing still. I kept glancing up at him, pretending to be on the computer. He stood there for a while, and then slowly walked back and sat in the lounge again like nothing happened. I called my manager at home and explained what was going on. She sounded tired and told me to just keep an eye on him and call the police if he did anything threatening. I remember hanging up and thinking that it already felt threatening, but I didn't know what else to do. I checked the security cameras after that. I saw him on the first floor hallway camera. He walked all the way down the hall, stopped at the end, stood there for several minutes, then walked back. Later he went into the stairwell and stayed in there for about 10 minutes. I don't know what he was doing in there. Every time I looked up from the computer, he was somewhere else, near the vending machines or by the elevators, once just standing near the corner of the lobby where the light didn't hit well. He was always staring. By 3:30, I couldn't take it anymore, so I called the non-emergency police line and explained that there was a man in the hotel who I didn't think was a guest. They said they'd send someone. While I was waiting, I noticed he moved again, this time closer to the desk. He was standing maybe 15 feet away, just watching me. He didn't blink much, and he definitely didn't speak. He just stared like he had a staring problem. I pretended to type something on the computer, but I was so scared I could hardly breathe. At around 3:50, the buzzer went off, and I thought maybe it was the cops already, but it was just another guest coming back late. I let him in quickly, and the man turned his head and watched the guest walk past. I noticed his eyes follow him the whole way across the lobby. That scared me even more, because it was like he was studying him. A few minutes later, the man disappeared again. I checked the cameras and saw him standing outside one of the guest room doors on the first floor, like he was literally just standing there. So that's when I called actual 911. I told them he was outside a guest's room and I didn't know what he was trying to do. They said officers were on the way. I kept my eyes glued on the camera feed, and he just stood at the door for about 3 minutes, then slowly walked back to the lobby. When he came back, he walked right up to the desk this time and leaned over the counter. He
bold.
And asked if there was any food. His voice was so low it was disturbing. I told him there were vending machines in the corner. He gave a small smile, then walked away. I just sat there staring at the clock, begging the cops to get there. Finally, around 4:10, 2 officers showed up. I let them in and pointed right at him. He was back in the lounge, sitting down. They walked over and talked to him for a few minutes. They asked for his ID and asked him questions I couldn't hear. Then they walked him out. One of the officers came back and explained that the guy wasn't a guest at all. The credit card he gave me was stolen, and he had no bags or reservation. He had just been pretending so he could get access to the building. They charged him with trespassing and the stolen card. After they left, I sat there shaking until my shift was over. Every time I looked at the cameras, I expected to see him again. The part that messed me up the most was realizing he had been inside the hotel for hours, wandering around and standing outside guest rooms, watching me from different spots, and he was never even supposed to be there. I have no idea what his plan was, but I know it wasn't good. That was the scariest night of my life. My name is Meredith. I'm 24, and I work the night shift at a tiny gas station off County Road 11. It's the kind of place most people don't even notice unless they're out of gas or completely lost. I took the job because it was quiet and predictable. I liked that, or at least I used to. It started on a Thursday night around 1 a.m. The air outside was wet and still, and the hum of the overhead lights had been getting under my skin all shift. I was just about to microwave a cinnamon roll I didn't even really want when the door chimed. A man walked in, mid-40s, maybe older. He had a green coat, messy hair, and dry lips like he hadn't smiled in years. He didn't head for the coffee or chips like most people. He just stood near the counter, staring at me with a strange kind of familiarity. "Hi," I said, forcing a polite smile. Then the man said, "You always work this late?" I blinked and said,
Yeah.
"Yeah, mostly." He smiled.
That's
Then
the
he
wrong
said,
answer.
"I figured. I've passed through a few times. Noticed it's always you." That unsettled me more than I let show. "Oh yeah, right, small town," I said. He didn't leave. "Meredith, right?"
Mm.
I wasn't wearing a name tag. I was about to ask him how he knew, but he followed it with saying that I have nice handwriting, and he motioned to the whiteboard where I had written cinnamon coffee is back. Most people dot their I's like circles. You use little slashes. It's very specific. Thoughtful. I didn't respond. He didn't buy anything, just stood there for another minute watching me, like he was studying my reactions. Then he finally nodded. "I'm Paul," he said.
I don't give a fuck.
"That's all." And then he walked out into the fog. After that, he started showing up randomly. Not every night, not enough to scream stalker out loud, but often enough that I stopped assuming it was a coincidence. Sometimes he'd come inside, sometimes he'd just sit in his car.
He would come inside?
One night, I tried to ignore him.
Yeah,
Came in, bought a bottle of water, and lingered like always. "You're quieter tonight," he said. "Long shift," I muttered. He slowly looked around the store, like he was taking inventory of everything. "It must get lonely, just you out here in the dark, no one else for miles," he said. "I'm fine," I replied. He leaned on the counter. "You ever get scared, being a woman alone at night?" His voice wasn't threatening, that's what made it worse. It was curious, like neutral, like he was asking about the weather. I stepped back, and I asked, "Do you need anything else?" He tilted his head. "You always keep the door to the back room locked. Smart. I noticed you check it around 2 a.m. almost every night." My stomach turned. I didn't answer. "I'll let you get back to it," he said, with a soft, almost apologetic smile. "Didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." Walked out again. After that night, I started walking to my car with my keys between my fingers. I kept a tire iron under the counter. I changed the curtains in my apartment, started showering with the bathroom door locked even when no one else was home. There were nights he didn't come. Sometimes I'd go a whole week without seeing him, but it didn't help. It actually made it worse, because I never knew when he'd reappear. Like the time I came back from my 10-minute break to find a Polaroid on the counter. It was me, refilling the windshield washer bin behind the station. It was taken from that night, close up, way too close. There was no note along with it, but the slash dot on the word I and the word windshield on the bin label had been circled in red ink. The next time he came in, I told him to leave. I told him if he stayed, I'd call the police. Paul just nodded. "I get it. I've been too forward." "You've been following me," I said, with my voice cracking, and I hated that it did. "I just think you're the kind of person who's used to being misunderstood. I thought maybe you'd appreciate someone who pays attention," he said. "That's not paying attention, that's obsession," I replied. He didn't flinch. Would it be easier if I wore a smile and brought a soda every night? Would I be more normal if I just talked about sports and pretended I didn't notice the way your shoes are always a half size too big, or how your left eyelid twitches when you're tired? By this point, I was already dialing 911. He didn't stop me. The police came quickly, and he didn't resist. He just stood there, arms at his sides, waiting. They searched his car and found a notepad filled with dates and times. It was my schedule. Notes about my walk, my clothes, my groceries. One page just had my name written over and over again in tighter and tighter loops until it turned into scribbles. He kept telling the cops the same thing. "I just noticed things. I'm just a curious guy." The restraining order went through that week. Now I don't work nights anymore. I don't even live in the same town. The company transferred me to another station 2 hours away. But even now, when I drive home and see headlights behind me for too long, I feel the back of my neck tingle. And sometimes, I still think about the way he said my name, like he already knew what it would sound like in his mouth, like he'd been practicing it. I want to start this off by saying at the time I'm writing this happened to me just last night. I worked the overnight shift at a 24-hour gas station. I'm a 22-year-old female, and I've been working there just shy of 2 months. I work the weekend shifts, which is Thursday through Saturday, while another coworker, who I'll call Max for privacy reasons, works the weekdays of Sunday through Wednesday. My coworker Max and a friend of his I'll call Ben had come into the station at about 2:30 a.m. to get some coffee and say hi. Max and his friend had taken some magic mushrooms a couple hours before they came in, so when I saw them, they were all giggly and shit. Honestly, it was pure entertainment for me. As we were talking about random stuff, Ben had made the comments about how there was a car parked in the parking lot with its lights off but running, with someone inside that had been there before they pulled in. He said when he questioned the guy said he was waiting for a DoorDash order. Normally that wasn't out of the ordinary for DoorDashers to wait in their car while we packed an order up. What was odd was I hadn't received an order in almost 2 hours. I spent most of the night in the back of the store cleaning, away from the tills and the front doors, so I couldn't even see the parking lot. We waved it off as nothing, and the two guys went outside to smoke a cigar and play with Max's dog, who they brought along. At first, I didn't think much of it, but once I was alone, I thought it was a little weird considering I didn't know how long they'd been out there before my coworker came in. Fast forward about an hour, and they came back in to get more coffee. It was at that point Max told me more about how the car had been out there parked in a spot that even when I went to the register, I couldn't see it due to the wall. He told me that the entire hour they were out there playing with his dog and smoking in the parking lot, the man in the car had switched between watching them and looking like he was texting someone on his phone. When Ben had noticed this, in his high as hell state, he walked over to the car and asked, "What's up? Why are you looking at us?" At that point, the man had tried to pretend he didn't speak any English. When that didn't work, he switched to English and started saying he must have had the wrong address before hightailing it out of the parking lot. He was definitely higher than Max at that point, but what made it really creepy was Max said that the car looked brand new and had no license plate. He also noticed there was a pile of blankets in the back, enough to hide someone under. And when the man was confronted, another car had just pulled into the lot with its lights off, a car that also looked brand new and had no license plates. And as soon as the first car had started driving away, the car that had just pulled in immediately followed them out. Max had stayed another 15 minutes before they headed out and told me to be careful and to keep an eye out. At about 6 a.m., he came back in for more coffee, and he was definitely sober, so we talked more about it. He said the guy was acting super suspicious the entire time they were out there, constantly checking his phone and watching them along with the entrance to the parking lot and the doors to the store. Even he admitted that he was freaked out, and once he came down from his high, he wanted to check on me to make sure I was all right. We both decided that had they not been there, this whole scenario could have gone one of several ways. I don't know if it was a pure coincidence, or if those two cars were planning on doing something to me as soon as Max and Ben had left and I was alone. I may carry a knife on my person for protection, but my gut tells me that from what they described, that if there were multiple people, it might not have been any good. And if they hadn't been there, just playing like kids in the parking lot, something terrible just might have happened to me. I work again tonight, and I'll update if anything happens during my shift. I really wish I didn't have an update for you, but I do. The car came back again during my shift. This is how it happened. It was about 3 a.m., and I was mopping the floors when 4 guys came in to get coffee and some snacks. I was ringing them up when one of them asked if I knew anything about the car that was at the far end of the parking lot, running with its lights off. I looked at the man and asked, "What car?" He then went on to tell me there was what looked like a brand new Subaru with no license plates running with what looked like 2 guys arguing in the front seats. I could feel my heart drop into my stomach when he said this. I told the group that a car with that same description had been sitting in the parking lot the night before, but there was only one guy in it, who I assumed to be the leader of this group, told me as they were pumping gas, they noticed the car as it had been there when they...
Wow, I actually kind of like this shit. It's actually kind of good.
He told me as they were walking to the doors, they passed the car, since they were at the pump farthest from the doors. He said that as they passed, they could hear a guy not quite yelling, but talking pretty loud and pointing towards the doors of the store. As they passed, one of the guys started to walk towards the car to ask if everything was okay. When the guys in the car finally noticed them, they proceeded to put the car in reverse and drive away. I told them that I believed that was the same car from the night before that had been acting suspicious when there were others in the parking lot, and when confronted, he seemed panicked before leaving with another car following him out. They seemed alarmed and offered to stay with me for a bit to make sure they didn't come back. I asked if they were sure, and when they told me it was no problem, they hung around for about 20 minutes before we all decided I was probably in the clear. I thanked them again and let them top off their coffee for free before they headed out, and I was left alone. Nothing else happened the rest of my shift, but I sure as hell kept an eye out when I eventually had to go outside to change the trash at the gas pumps. What's scariest to me is not once did I see this car, but had multiple people warn me about it. At first, I was hoping I was just paranoid and it was really nothing, but to have the same car come 2 nights in a row, at almost the same time, and park in a spot that couldn't be seen from the register or the front windows, makes me wonder if my paranoia is justified. If it is, I'm just glad I had another group of people show up so I wasn't alone if those guys in the car had decided to come in. Thankfully, I don't work for the next few days, and I can only hope when I work again, the car doesn't show up. My name is Daniel. I'm 29, and I work the overnight shift at a small rural motel. It's not a chain, just a family-owned place with 2 floors and maybe 25 rooms in total. I usually work from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. The motel doesn't get much traffic at night, maybe a couple check-ins after midnight if someone is traveling through, but most of the time, it's dead quiet. That's why I took the job. I'm not really a people person, so sitting in an empty building most nights works for me. The way it's set up is there's a main office with the front desk, some chairs, a coffee machine, and a little rack of brochures. Behind the desk is a hallway that leads to a back office. That back office is kind of like a lounge. It has another desk, a couch, a mini fridge, and a TV mounted on the wall. The cool thing is that there's a little speaker back there that dings whenever someone rings the bell at the front desk. So normally I just sit in the back, watch something on my laptop, maybe nap on the couch, and then when I hear the bell, I get up and walk to the front. I've worked there long enough to know the regular rhythm of the place. The building creaks sometimes, the heater makes a clicking noise, and the front door buzzes when a guest uses their keycard after hours. Those are all normal sounds. But the thing about working the night shift is even the normal stuff can get under your skin if you think too much about it. And sometimes, the things that seem normal at first turn out not to be. This happened on a Tuesday night back in fall. It was cold outside, maybe in the 40s, and the parking lot was empty except for 4 or 5 cars belonging to guests. It was about 2 a.m. when I first heard the bell. I stood up from the couch in the back and went into the main office. When I got there, nobody was standing at the desk. The lobby was empty. I looked outside through the glass doors, but the road was dark and seemingly empty as well. There were no cars pulling in or headlights or anything. I thought maybe I had imagined it, but the bell is loud and clear, so I knew I hadn't. I stood there for a minute, waiting to see if anyone came in late, but no one did. So I went back to the lounge. I sat on the couch, pulled out my phone, and scrolled for a while. Not even 10 minutes later, the bell rang again. I jumped up and walked quickly into the main office, but once again it was empty. The hair on the back of my neck stood up this time. I went to the doors and stepped outside. The parking lot looked the same as before. The cars were all parked with their lights off and there was no movement anywhere. The road was completely empty too. I walked to the edge of the sidewalk and looked both ways, but there wasn't a single sign of life out there. I went back inside and sat behind the front desk this time instead of going to the back. I figured maybe some drunk person was messing with me, a ding-dong ditch of sorts. Maybe a guest's kid thought it was funny, but after sitting there for 15 minutes with nothing happening, I started to relax again. I leaned back in the chair, opened my laptop, and figured it was just one of those weird things I'd laugh about later. Then the bell rang again. I snapped my head up so fast that it hurt. The lobby was still empty, Nobody in sight. My skin started to crawl. I stood up and walked around the front desk to make sure nobody was hiding, but there was no one. I checked the bathrooms of the lobby. I even stepped outside again. Nothing. I walked the lot a little, shining my phone flashlight, but it was just dead quiet. I went back inside, and that's when I decided to try something different. Instead of going back to the lounge, I sat down in the chair right behind the front desk. If someone was sneaking
It's
around,
taking out the
just to
trash.
mess with me, I wanted to be there to catch them. I turned the lobby lights down a little so the room was dim, and I just sat there listening. It was so quiet that every little sound made me twitch. The clock ticking on the wall sounded louder than usual. The fridge in the back office clicked on and hummed. Every couple of minutes, the building creaked as it settled. I sat there with my arms crossed, staring at the bell on the counter. 15 minutes passed, then 20. My eyes started to get heavy, and I thought maybe the person had given up. I even started thinking I just imagined the whole thing. Just as I was letting myself relax and doze off, it happened. The bell rang, only this time I saw what was doing it. A pale hand came up from under the front desk, reaching over the counter and pressing the bell right in front of me. I jumped up so fast I'm sure the chair almost fell over, and I bolted down the hall into the back office. I slammed the door and locked it, and I stood there in the dark, my chest pounding. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how someone could even be under there. The desk doesn't have much space underneath, but it's enough for someone to crouch if they squeezed in. That meant they'd been hiding just a few feet away from me, waiting. I forced myself to look at the security monitors. There were 4 cameras, one on the lobby, one on the hallway, and 2 on the parking lot. On the lobby feed, I saw the chair had apparently tipped over in my rush. The counter looked empty. Then in the bottom corner of the frame, I saw movement. A head poked out from behind the desk. I couldn't make out details, just the outline and the glint of eyes staring straight into the camera. I backed away from the monitor. I couldn't look at it. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 with shaking hands. I whispered to the dispatcher that someone had broken in and was hiding in the lobby. She told me to stay where I was and that officers were on the way.
No.
I was on the phone. I watched the monitor. The person's head disappeared, and then I saw the person crawl out from behind the desk on hands and knees. He crawled to the door and then stood up. He was tall and wearing a hoodie with the hood pulled tight, and his posture was hunched over. Then he turned around and started walking around the lobby like he was looking for something, and then he
Looking for you.
the camera frame toward the hallway that led to the back office. I pressed my back against the locked door. A moment later, the knob rattled. Just once, a very slow rattle, and then nothing. The dispatcher kept asking if I was safe, but I couldn't even answer for a few seconds because my throat felt like it was closing up. After what felt like forever, I heard slow footsteps moving away. I rushed back to the monitor. The man was pacing around the lobby again. At one point, he stood in front of the glass doors and just stared outside like he was waiting for someone. Then he walked over to the brochure rack and started flipping through the papers, as if he were sarcastically killing time. Minutes dragged by. Finally, I saw flashing blue and red lights through the parking lot cameras. The cops pulled up. 2 cars. The man must have seen it too, because he suddenly bolted out of frame. A second later, I heard the front doors open. When the officers cleared the building, they found a large rock near the front door that was presumably used to prop the front door open, but they didn't find him inside. He was gone. They searched the lot, checked the road, and the officer told me whoever it was must have slipped out as soon as they pulled up. I kept replaying it in my head after. The way that hand just came up from under the desk and pressed the bell, calm as anything. Now every time I hear that bell at night, I think of that night and experience. I don't think I'll ever look at that desk the same way again.
um,
Back when I was 20, during the summer before my senior year of college, I landed an internship at a financial services firm downtown. It wasn't anything fancy, mostly data entry, spreadsheets, and sitting in front of a computer all day, but it paid decently and it looked great on a resume. There were 7 other interns behind me, and we were all crammed together in this open office section with rows of cubicles that didn't quite give you privacy, just enough to make small talk feel optional. Out of the 7, 5 of them were people I liked, a mix of chill, down-to-earth college students who didn't take the internship too seriously. Another guy, Eric, was the type who treated the whole thing like it was life or death, barely spoke, and was always typing like his keyboard owed him money. But the 7th intern, Alex, was something else entirely. When I first met Alex, he seemed normal enough, maybe a little awkward, but we all were at the beginning. He was tall, thin, kind of pale, and had this mop of dark hair that always looked a little unwashed. He didn't really fit the finance intern stereotype, but that's not what threw me off. It was the way he acted around me. At first, it was subtle. He'd pop up at my cubicle during the day, lean over the divider in a way that made him look freakishly tall, like 7 feet tall because the cubicle walls were low, and only his head would be visible above it. He'd tilt his head slightly, grin with a strange frozen smile, and start talking in this deliberately weird voice, like he was trying to sound creepy on purpose. I'd laugh it off awkwardly, pretending I thought it was funny, but I remember thinking it was an odd thing to do in a professional setting. He'd say random stuff, like working hard or hardly working, Ronnie, in that slow, unnatural tone, and then hold the smile for way too long. The first couple of times, I figured he was just being quirky or trying too hard to stand out. Some people at internships are awkward like that, so I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. But then it started happening more often. Every single day, at least once, I'd see his head slowly rise above my cubicle wall. That same stretched grin plastered across his annoying face. I'd start some bizarre conversation that didn't make sense. Sometimes he'd make jokes that weren't funny, or mutter random phrases that didn't relate to anything. And every time, he used that same unsettling voice, like a soft voice in a kind of taunting way. Honestly, a very good recent comparison of the voice he was doing was the voice Charlie Hunnam did for his role as Ed Gein. The other interns noticed it too, but they mostly laughed it off, thinking Alex was being weird on purpose to lighten the mood. I also think they thought Alex and I had built some kind of rapport that the rest of them didn't build with him. There was something about the way he directed it only at me that made me feel uncomfortable. It's not like I treated him any differently. It was like I was his personal audience for whatever creepy act he was trying to pull. As the weeks went on, his visits got longer. He'd lean over and stay there for minutes at a time, staring at me while talking, sometimes not even saying much, just looking. I'd fake a laugh, say I had to finish a report, and hope he'd get the hint. He rarely did. Then one night, about 6 weeks into the internship, I was home eating dinner when my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. I normally don't answer unknown calls, but since I was expecting a delivery confirmation, I picked it up. When I said hello, all I heard for a few seconds was silence. Then, suddenly, I heard a voice I recognized immediately. It was Alex's voice. The same forced, creepy tone he always used in the office. He said, "The tide's coming in. Pull your boat out of the water." But this time, his voice was a little louder, almost a yell. He dragged the words out like he was reciting a riddle, and then he burst out laughing this insanely unhinged laugh before hanging up. The thing that made my skin crawl wasn't just the call. It was the fact that I never gave Alex my number, not once. The next thing I did was text the number back, asking if this was Alex. But the text said not delivered, and when I looked it up, it was a landline number. That's when I really started to get freaked out. How did he get my number? Why was he calling me like that? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he found it through a company contact sheet or something. But even then, the way he said that line didn't sit with me. I couldn't stop replaying the sound of his laugh in my head. It didn't sound like someone joking around. It sounded like he was f***ing with me to the point of trying to actually scare me. This wasn't just goofy behavior anymore. That Monday, when I got to the office, Alex wasn't there. His desk was empty, and I didn't see him all morning. I went to our supervisor, a guy named Martin, and I asked him if Alex might have gotten my number through the company. And Martin was very confused, saying interns didn't have access to employee info like that. On top of that, they'd let Alex go at the end of the previous week because he wasn't doing any work and had ignored multiple warnings. That's when I told him about the call. He seemed surprised, and some of the other interns overheard. A couple of them started nodding and saying they always thought Alex was creepy, that he'd made them uncomfortable too. I told them about the weird cubicle visits, the voice, everything. Martin said not to worry, that Alex was gone for good and had no reason to come back. So that was a little comforting. For the next week or so, I kept expecting something else to happen. A message, a random encounter, something, but nothing came. Life at the office went back to normal. I figured maybe that was really the end of it. Until one early morning. It was a Friday, around 5 a.m. Still dark outside, except for a thin gray light creeping in through the blinds. I woke up because I thought I'd heard something, maybe a noise from outside. It made me get up and look out my window. I wish I hadn't. Standing in my backyard, halfway between the trees and the porch light, was a figure looking up at my window. Even though it was barely light out, I could tell who it was immediately. The thin frame and the messy hair, the way he stood perfectly straight. It was Alex. For a few seconds, I could not move. I just stared at him, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. And then, clear as day, I heard him call out my name in that same creepy, performative voice he'd always used at work. He dragged it out, long and sing-songy. I grabbed my phone, about to call 911, when I saw him tilt his head back and start laughing. That same loud, hysterical laughter like he did on the phone before hanging up. It didn't sound right. It sounded like someone completely detached from reality. I shouted through the window, yelling at him that I was calling the police and to get the hell off my property. I also waved my phone out the window. He just stood there for a second longer, then turned and started walking away, still laughing as he disappeared into the trees behind my house. I called the police, and in short, the dispatcher asked me if he was still there. When I said no, she told me to call back if he came back or threatened to break in. I never saw him again after that. Not at work, not around town, nowhere. The police couldn't do much since he hadn't technically broken in or made a direct threat. It was one of those situations where you just have to live with the unease, hoping it's over. The rest of the summer passed without incident. I finished the internship, and on the last day, my boss pulled me aside to offer me a permanent position for after graduation. At the time, I accepted, though a small part of me felt unsettled about ever going back to that office again. I never told them about what had happened that morning. I didn't see the point. Alex was gone, and no one even knew where he'd ended up. Over time, I convinced myself that he must have been dealing with some kind of mental illness or social disorder, something that made him act that way. It's the only way I can make sense of how he went from a quiet, awkward intern to standing in my backyard at 5 in the morning, laughing like a lunatic. It's been a few years now, and I've moved on from it. I didn't end up with that company. I got a different job after graduation. I don't think about this too often anymore, but sometimes the thought of that image of him in my backyard still skeeves me out. I still wonder how he got my number, how he found my address, and what he wanted that morning.
Somebody gave it to
It's
him.
hard to get people's info online these days.
Somebody
All I
gave
know
that
is
shit
that
to
for a
him.
few months in my life, I worked alongside someone who wasn't just strange, he had something way deeper going on. And no matter how many years pass, I'll never forget the sound of him laughing in the dark, as if it was all one big joke that
Yeah.
only he understood. I was 17 when this all happened. It was my first real job, working at a local grocery store in our quiet Vermont town. The kind of town where everyone knew everyone else, and where nothing ever really happened. I liked the job at first. It was simple, and most of my coworkers were friendly. I quickly fell into a rhythm with the cashiers and some of the especially during the slow hours when there weren't many customers. When that happened, we'd all gather near the front of the store, just chatting about random stuff like what we watched on TV, making fun of the older, quirkier employees, and complaining about customers. That sort of thing. It was one of the few times during my shifts where I felt like I wasn't just standing behind a register staring at a screen or a blank wall all day. Depending on who was the shift supervisor for the day, it would either be relaxed or more strict. Like if a younger supervisor was working, it would be more chill. People would be on their phones and people would socialize by the front. There was one coworker who I didn't know well at first, a guy named Sean. He was 24, a little awkward, the kind of guy who always seemed like he didn't quite know how to read social cues. He had longer hair, but kind of in the awkward in-between phase, like he was growing it out but didn't quite reach his shoulders yet. He worked in the dairy section, so we didn't interact much at work. He was quiet and polite enough, and I honestly didn't think much of him. Most people just nodded at him when they walked past, and he did the same. But eventually, I was added to a coworker group chat, and he was in it. I didn't think twice about it. It was just a chat for work stuff and dumb jokes, and it seems most of the younger employees were in there. But then Sean started messaging me directly. At first it was harmless. He asked about my shifts, whether I was covering certain days, things like that. But over the next few weeks, it became clear he was trying to get closer. He started asking questions about my personal life, like what music I liked, what I do after work, even little things like what I did over the weekend. Again, I didn't think much of it at first. I mean, people make small talk, right? But the tone was off. Sometimes he'd call me cute in ways that made me uncomfortable. Sometimes he'd make jokes that were slightly flirty. I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe he just didn't know how to behave with girls my age. That's another thing. I was only 17, he was decently older than me, and I don't think anyone else knew he was flirting with me like that. It didn't take long before the behavior became slightly annoying. He'd comment on things I posted online, and sometimes the messages were late at night. Not threatening, not really, but there was this persistence in him that made me uneasy. I didn't know how to tell him to back off without making it awkward at work, so I mostly ignored him. Don't shit where you eat, I always hear people say. One day, I was at home watching Stranger Things, my favorite show still to this day. I'd been catching up on the latest season, binge watching episodes in my bedroom, just completely lost in the show. And then a couple days later at work, everyone was gathered at the front of the store chatting about TV shows. I was talking with a few of the cashiers about some random series, when Sean suddenly asked me, "You like Stranger Things, right?" I froze. I couldn't remember telling anyone at work about my show. I just nodded, trying to brush it off, but it left this cold feeling in my stomach. How did he know? I didn't say anything. I did make eye contact for a moment. He just smiled awkwardly and eventually left the front of the store back to the dairy section like nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me more than I had realized. It wasn't until a few nights later that the fear really started. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep after a long day at work. The house was quiet, and then I heard a soft scraping noise against my bedroom window. At first, I thought it was the wind or maybe a branch brushing against the glass, but then I heard it again. A distinct sound of someone tapping on the window, just lightly enough for it to be unnerving. I got up and peeked through the blinds, half expecting to see Sean out there, but there was nothing. I tried to convince myself the sound was nothing to be alarmed about, but the thought of Sean's question at work, about Stranger Things, a show I hadn't told anyone about, it kept running through my head. A couple of days later, he texted me again. This time I didn't ignore it. I told him clearly and firmly that I wasn't interested. That was when things escalated. Almost immediately, he replied, "Okay, good luck changing your address." In one insane text that he clearly sent before thinking of the repercussions, he proved my suspicions right. I saved the messages and took screenshots. I went straight to my manager and explained everything. My manager was shocked. He told me not to worry, that they'd handle it. I also went with my dad to the local police department to file a report, showing them the messages and explaining the incident with the window, explaining that I suspected Sean might be stalking me. The next day at work, Sean was called in by our boss. He didn't come back. It turned out he was fired on the spot, and the police started the paperwork for a restraining order. I thought maybe that would be the end of it, but I quickly realized that nothing really felt over. Even with the restraining order in place, if he was actually a crazy person, what's a piece of paper gonna do to stop him from coming back to the house and doing something crazy? I double-checked locks obsessively, refused to answer any calls or messages from unknown numbers, and avoided talking about my routines with anyone except family. The weeks dragged on like that. I would wake up at night convinced I heard something outside. I had to remind myself constantly that the restraining order was legally binding, that he couldn't come near me, but the fear was real. Eventually, as the weeks turned into months, the paranoia started to fade. There were no incidents, no attempts to contact me, no sudden appearances. The restraining order seemed to hold, and life slowly returned to normal. I got more comfortable going out alone, stopped checking my window obsessively before bed, and eventually, I stopped thinking about Sean altogether. It took a long time, though, for me to feel fully safe again. Even after moving on, the experience left a mark. I was hyper-aware of my surroundings, cautious about new people I met, especially in situations where I felt isolated. I learned to trust my instincts and take any uncomfortable behavior seriously, no matter how small it seemed at first. Looking back, the thing that scares me most isn't that Sean might have actually harmed me. It's how quickly someone who seems normal, even awkward or harmless, can turn into a source of fear. It can start with small, seemingly innocent interactions, messages, questions, little comments, and escalate into something far more serious. Now, years later, I've moved past it. I work in a different town, live in a new apartment, and I don't think about that grocery store anymore. I don't talk to a single coworker from that job anymore. But the memory of those nights lying in bed, convinced someone was outside my window, it's not something that ever goes away entirely. It's a reminder of how quickly life can feel unsafe, even in a small, quiet town where nothing ever seems to happen. And while Sean never came close to doing anything physically, the psychological impact was enough to make me question how safe I ever truly was. So if you're ever at work and notice a coworker crossing a line, even subtly, take it seriously. Don't brush it off as awkwardness or harmless flirting. It might seem over the top at first, but it could save you from months of fear, or worse. Because sometimes, the danger isn't obvious. But eventually, I did move on. And now, years later, I can look back and say I survived. And that's enough. When I was 26, I started working at a small insurance office in a quiet part of Pennsylvania. The kind of office that's tucked behind a strip mall with one long row of desks, flickering fluorescent lights, and the smell of coffee at all hours of the day. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and I liked most of the people there. The job could get boring, especially on slow days when the phones barely rang, but it was easy money. I usually worked the day shift, but on this particular Friday, I was scheduled to help close up the office because we were behind on filing a batch of client records. There was a big storm warning that afternoon, the kind that takes over the entire local news broadcast. The moment I woke up and looked out the window that morning, I knew it was going to be a dark, stormy day. And around 3 o'clock, the rain started to pour so heavily you couldn't see the end of the street. The thunder came soon after, shaking the windows every few minutes. Honestly, I was personally enjoying the ambiance of the storm. Then the manager decided to let most of the employees leave early before it got worse, but a couple of us volunteered to stay to finish some paperwork. The only other person who stayed was a guy named Tom, who had just started working there about 2 weeks prior. He was in his early 30s, tall, quiet, and sort of off-putting in a way I couldn't describe. I wouldn't say creepy, just strange. He never said much to anyone, but he was always nearby. If I went to make coffee, he'd be there 2 minutes later. If I was restocking paper, he'd show up pretending to do the same thing. I figured he was just socially awkward. When 5 o'clock hit, the storm was in full force. I swear, every few seconds lightning flashed, followed by thunder that made the floor vibrate. The office felt emptier than usual, and the usual hum of lights was replaced.
Ah, that's so much better. I don't know why the hell I didn't do that sooner.
At his desk a few rows down, typing something on his computer that looked like nonsense from where I sat. Every time I looked up, I could see him glancing over in my direction. At first, I tried to focus on my work, but after an hour,
Just to tell you how long I haven't used
I hadn't seen him get up once.
digital art.
Around 6:30, the power started flickering. Both of us made the same nervous laugh when the lights dimmed, but he didn't say anything. The next flicker lasted longer, and when the power finally went out completely, the office went silent except for the rain. The emergency lights kicked in, leaving everything bathed in a faint orange glow. I said something about maybe it being a good time to head out, but Tom didn't respond. I heard the sound of keys jingling, and then the front door locking. He muttered something about how it wasn't safe to go outside right now. I thought maybe he was just trying to be helpful, but something about the way he said it gave me chills. I went to grab my bag and jacket, figuring I'd wait it out for a few minutes before heading home. The power outage made the whole building feel smaller. The emergency lights barely lit the hallways, and the storm outside was deafening. When I came back toward the front, Tom was standing near the door, just staring out into the dark parking lot. The rain was falling so heavily you couldn't see anything past the glass. I told him I was going to make a quick call to my boyfriend to let him know I'd be home soon. He didn't say anything again. He stood there staring out the window. I walked toward the break room, but when I tried using my phone, there was no signal. I figured the storm must have knocked out the tower. I tried the landline, but the line was dead too. I turned around to go back to the main office, and nearly jumped when I saw Tom standing in the doorway. I hadn't even heard him walk up. He was holding a small flashlight under his chin, casting shadows up his face. He had this half smile, like he thought it was funny. I forced a nervous laugh and told him he scared me. I then asked him again about unlocking the door so I could leave, but he said something about it not being safe yet, and how it was better to wait until the worst of the storm passed. I said fine, but inside I was starting to feel nervous. He kept watching me. I decided to move to my cubicle to pack up my stuff, pretending to be calm. I wanted to wait for a lull in the storm and then get out. When I looked up again a few minutes later, Tom was gone. I figured maybe he went to the restroom. I took the chance to head to the back door instead of the front one. I knew that one led to a small parking lot behind the building where my car was. When I reached it, I realized the handle wouldn't move. The door was chained shut from the inside, like
Are you
a
fucking...
chain and padlock around it. We had never done that before. I turned around and saw the faint glow of the flashlight coming from down the hallway. I ducked into the supply closet next to the break room and closed the door quietly, trying to keep my breathing under control. I could hear Tom walking slowly through the hall, and then I heard him call my name. He sounded like he was trying to sound comforting. He said he just wanted to make sure I was safe. I didn't move or say a word. My heart was pounding so hard I thought he could probably hear it. He walked past the closet, and for a few seconds, I could see the thin strip of light from the flashlight shining under the door. Then it disappeared. A loud crack of thunder made the building shake. The sound of rain got even louder for a second, and I realized part of the roof above the break room must have been leaking. I waited, I'd estimate 10 minutes before I finally worked up the nerve to open the door a little. The hall was empty. The flashlight beam was gone. I stepped out carefully and made my way toward the front again. When I turned the corner, I froze. The front glass door had been shattered completely. Rain was blowing inside across the floor, soaking the carpet. Tom was nowhere in sight. I hesitated, wondering if he had gone outside, but then I realized this was my only chance. I ran out the door into the pouring rain and sprinted for my car. I didn't even care that I was getting drenched. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I sped out of the parking lot without looking back once. When I finally got home, I locked every door and sat in my living room shaking, watching the rain pour against my windows. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning,
Really?
I called the office and told my manager what had happened. He didn't believe me at first, until he got there himself and saw the broken glass. He called the police, who showed up and took a statement from me when I was at the office. They said they'd look into it, but it sounded like Tom had just taken off. His car was still in the lot, unlocked, with the keys sitting on the driver's seat. His phone, wallet, and a few personal items were still inside. The security cameras had been turned off manually before the power outage, which meant he must have done it earlier in the night. Nobody ever saw him again. A few of my coworkers said maybe he had some kind of breakdown, but I couldn't stop wondering if he'd been planning something worse. I quit the job a month later. Even though nothing ever happened after that, I couldn't work in a small, enclosed place like that where I had experienced such a traumatic incident. It just wasn't healthy.
Damn. Okay. We listen to a small one, cause it's about time I go. Okay.
This story's pretty detailed, so I'm gonna get right into it. Only relevant details, though. I'm 22 years old, freshly graduated from college. Since I was maybe 3 or 4, my family's lived in a 3-story home in a relatively nice area. If you're picturing the quintessential suburban neighborhood, you've got the right idea. As for the layout of the house, this is all you need to know. My bedroom, which is on the 2nd floor, has a window that faces the street, and the only window in my dad's home office, which is on the 3rd floor, also faces the street. That's it. The reason I'm writing this is because after the events of last week, I'm now 100% convinced something sinister is happening to my family for some inexplicable reason I can't even begin to conceive of. And if I'm connecting the dots correctly, which I'm pretty sure I am, it's been going on for years. This first relevant thing happened so long ago that I don't even remember how old I was, but I was young enough to still be in middle school, so it had to have been at least 10 years ago. It was either a Saturday or a Sunday since I didn't have school, and as I was walking downstairs for breakfast, I overheard my parents talking in the kitchen. I didn't catch much of the conversation, but I was able to hear my dad talking about how something had happened again, and it must have been at least a little concerning judging by the tone he was using. My parents didn't tell me what was going on when I asked them about it. They actually didn't tell me directly for over a year afterwards, but I learned the real story a few days later from my older brother. My dad's a lawyer and often works into the night whenever he's pressured to finish something that doesn't get done at the office, and that's what he was doing until about 2 a.m. the night before I overheard him talking to my mom about the incident. According to my dad, he was working away at his desk at around midnight when he noticed a Chevy Suburban drive down the street at like 5 miles per hour. That's not an exaggeration. He claims to this day that the car looked like it was crawling down the street, as if someone had taken their foot off both the gas and the brake and was just letting the car idle forward. My dad didn't think much of it until he saw the exact same car drive back down the street, only this time in the opposite direction. And then, even more strangely, the car actually parked across the street, right in front of our house. My dad didn't take his eye off the car for a good few minutes straight, waiting to see whether someone would get out of the car or if it would drive off. But neither happened. The car just sat there. My dad didn't have the time or the patience to devote the rest of the night to watching the car, so he went back to glancing out the window every so often out of curiosity. But nothing happened for hours. He swore no one ever got out of the car, since he would have noticed movement out the window if they had. Eventually, he fell asleep at his desk around 2 a.m. without even completing his work. But here's the crazy part. When he woke up around 5:30, the car was still there in the exact same spot. What happened while he was asleep remains a mystery, but my dad said he was so shocked to see the car still there when he woke up, he thought he was dreaming. The car ended up leaving before sunrise, and even after finishing his work, my dad was so unsettled he couldn't sleep. I would eventually learn that this wasn't the first instance of something similar happening, that my dad had seen cars drive back and forth on our street late at night before, but it was definitely the strangest. No one in the family really thought anything of it for several years though. It was most likely just someone sleeping in a very coincidental spot, and at the very worst, it was someone driving around random nice neighborhoods and casing houses. Fast forward a few years. I'm 15 now, a sophomore in high school. I remember the second occurrence much more distinctly, partly because it was more recent and partly because it actually happened to me. I was up late making beats in my room, something I did quite often during that time in my life. Like I said earlier, my room has a window that faces the street, which I can always see out of since my desk is right in front of it. I was vibing out with my headphones in when something from outside my bedroom window caught my eye. It was a little flicker of light, definitely unnatural and definitely not my imagination. I diverted my attention to the window and saw the strangest, most unsettling thing. There was a squadron of cars, at least 3 of them. They were driving down the street at a slow speed. That by itself doesn't sound so bad, but I quickly realized that the people in the cars were shining flashlights at houses. That's what the flicker of light had been. I kept watching in this state of confused angst as whoever was in the first car swept their flashlight beam across the house next to mine. Then they started shining their light at my house, and I actually ducked down underneath my windowsill when I realized the beam was about to sweep right past my window. Not 2 seconds after ducking down, I watched the flashlight beam illuminate my ceiling for a couple seconds before everything went dark again. I waited a good 20 seconds before re-emerging, and by the time I did, the cars were much further down the street. I watched as they got to the end of the street and turned off. You can probably imagine how I was feeling in that moment. It was tough to get much sleep after that. I obviously told my parents about it the next morning, and as a family, we collectively agreed that it was a group of thugs casing houses, probably looking for ones with no one home that would make easy targets for a home intrusion. My dad installed a Ring camera after that, and he even put some security cameras with motion lights in our backyard. I can't remember for sure, but I think my parents might have talked to a few of our neighbors to see if anyone had experienced something similar. A couple years later, the next thing happened. While doing some landscaping in our backyard, one of the contractors my dad had hired claimed to have found a small hidden camera tucked into one of the bushes near the fence. It was tiny, no bigger than a car key, but it was definitely a camera. It was battery powered, and the battery had long since died. It didn't have a SIM card or any memory card inside, which meant it wasn't storing anything locally or using cellular data. But that didn't rule out the possibility that it had been streaming footage to an external device nearby while it was active. My dad said the most likely explanation was that someone had been parked close enough to receive a live feed until the battery gave out. Why anyone would go through the trouble of hiding something like that on our property and then just leave it behind was a complete mystery to us, but it definitely wasn't the kind of thing that you stumble across by accident. As furious as my dad was, he couldn't figure out when or who had placed it there, even after combing through the last few months of security camera footage, or at least everything the thing had recorded and stored. I was convinced that one of my friends had been pranking us, but even after pestering all of them, no one fessed up to placing that camera there. My parents were really worried we were being targeted, and they even reported everything to the police, but the home security they had already installed was pretty top-notch, so it wasn't like they could upgrade things much. Nothing happened for a little while after that. It wasn't like there was...
my eyes.
We all just kind of moved on with our lives the way most people probably would. The next thing worth mentioning happened a few years after we discovered the camera. Our immediate next-door neighbors moved away, and their house was re-inhabited super quickly, like it was only vacant for a few weeks at most. That's not exactly the most unusual thing. My neighborhood has always been a very desirable place for families to live. However, I noticed pretty quickly that the people who moved in weren't parents, just a youngish couple with no children. I remember finding that odd considering the size of the house, but I assumed maybe they were planning on starting a family, or maybe they just wanted a big place all to themselves. On several occasions after they moved in, though, I caught them looking into our yard through their top floor window, always at strange hours, either really early in the morning or really late at night. At first, I figured they had a workstation or office up there like my dad, and they were just seated right in front of the window. But then I noticed they were always standing, which eliminated the desk hypothesis. I knew I was just being paranoid, but I'm a pretty observant person by nature, so if someone's gonna do something out of the ordinary, I'm gonna notice it. Either way, I didn't think much of it. Just found it mildly amusing that our neighbors seemed fascinated with the layout of our yard or whatever else it was that they were always looking at. One night, while walking my dog on the street,
Excuse me.
I couldn't help but notice my neighbors in their kitchen through their big bay window. They were sitting at a table, and for the first time since they had moved in, there was a third person with them. The guy had really distinctive features. He was fully bald, really muscular, and had the thickest eyebrows I'd ever seen. The three of them, he and the couple, were just sitting and talking at the table, nothing unusual. But as if they noticed me looking, the woman swiftly walked over to the window and pulled the curtains over it. She didn't actually look out the window at me. None of them did, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she shut the curtains because somehow she knew I was watching. Either way, I didn't forget about the man that had been with them. His face was just so distinctive. I don't really know what else to say. Okay, so now that you've made it this far, you're probably thinking that I'm some paranoid schizophrenic. I mean,
Yes.
that's what I'd be thinking too. But I would never in a million years be sending the story in if what happened next didn't happen. Like I said in the beginning, this happened last week, so about another few years after the last thing I talked about. A few weeks ago, my family took a trip to Paris. My older brother had been dating his girlfriend for years, and everyone was pretty much expecting him to propose while we were there because we were going with her family too. A few days into the trip, we were at this random bar. Everyone was there, me, my parents, my brothers, his girlfriend, and her parents. We were sitting in a booth enjoying a few drinks and having some good conversation. I was maybe halfway through my drink, zoning out of the conversation, when I happened to glance across the room. There was this guy sitting alone in a booth, just casually sipping his drink and looking around the room. Something about him seemed familiar, but I couldn't immediately place where I'd seen him before. But then, like a light switch had been turned on, I realized it was that man who I'd seen at my neighbor's kitchen table years ago. There was no way. I didn't want to believe it. What were the chances this random guy from my neighborhood would be in the exact same bar as my family in a foreign country, no less? I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, but the more I stared, the more certain I became that it was him. Then he caught me looking at him. We locked eyes for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. He knew, and he knew I knew. I could feel it. Then, without finishing his drink or paying his bill, he got up and walked out of sight. I immediately excused myself from the table and tried to follow him, but I couldn't figure out where he had gone. I ended up just sitting back down at the table, trying to suppress the nasty feeling I had. Telling myself that the guy just happened to be on vacation the same time we were was the only way I could continue my night with my sanity. A few days later, we were doing some typical touristy stuff. It was broad daylight, and we were just walking around the city when I saw him again. That same guy. I can't understate how shocking it was. If the first instance had just been a coincidence, this completely shattered that theory. He was standing maybe 50 feet from us, snapping pictures with a professional-looking camera. I couldn't tell for sure, but it kinda seemed like the camera was pointed in our direction, even though there was a famous monument behind us. I watched as he then turned a corner and disappeared out of sight. I finally told my parents about what was going on. I gave them every little detail and assured them I wasn't going crazy. My parents actually believed me, my dad especially, and he even suggested cutting the trip short. We didn't end up doing that, but the rest of the vacation was awful. When we finally got home, my dad checked as much security footage as was stored, but didn't find anything. I really don't know what to make of all of this. I don't know what these people want from us, or who they even are, but now I'm convinced they've been watching us for over a decade, which sounds insane, and I only have reason to believe things are going to escalate from here. I live near Angeles National Forest. I've been hiking those trails for years, and I know them well enough that I don't really worry about getting lost or anything like that. I'm comfortable out there. The night this all went down, I'd gotten some bad news over the phone earlier in the day. It was the kind of news that makes you feel like you need to get out of the house and clear your head. Some people drink when they're upset, some people call a friend. I go for a hike. It was around 8 when I set out. I wasn't planning anything ambitious. Just wanted to clear my head, maybe tire myself out enough so that I could actually sleep when I got back. Night hikes aren't unusual for me, especially on trails I know well. There's something about being out there in the dark that usually feels meditative. The fog that night was something else though. I had checked the weather before leaving, but conditions at elevation are always a gamble. By the time I was a little ways in, visibility had dropped to maybe 20 feet. Everything beyond that was just gray. I tried using my flashlight at first, but the beam just bounced back at me off the moisture in the air. It actually made things worse, like trying to drive with your high beams on in a snowstorm. So I mostly kept it off, letting my eyes adjust to what little ambient light filtered through. I had music playing to deter any animals from bothering me, which was something I picked up from my dad. About an hour in, I noticed a smell. It was faint at first, and I actually stopped walking for a second because it caught me so off guard. It didn't smell like natural wood smell. It kind of smelled like perfume, which I know sounds absurd, but that's genuinely what it smelled like. It wasn't strong or overwhelming, just this distinct floral scent that had no business being out there. I looked around, which was pointless because I couldn't see anything anyway, and by the time I'd finished scanning the fog, the smell was gone. I didn't really know what to make of it, so I just brushed it off. About 10 minutes later, though, there was a new smell. This time, it was something a little more familiar. Campfire. So I instantly connected the dots. There was someone camping somewhere out there, and that also probably explained the perfume smell. But the smell was only there for about 30 seconds before vanishing, which was a little strange. It wasn't until smelling the third smell that I thought something was really off. It was this herbal, almost earthy scent that I immediately recognized from my childhood but couldn't place. The familiarity of it, combined with how completely out of context it was, unsettled me. I probably should have turned around the moment things felt off, but I kept hiking. Things were normal for a while, and I started feeling better about everything. But as soon as I felt even the slightest sense of calm, I noticed a flashlight beam on the ridge to my left. The ridge runs parallel to the main trail, but sits maybe 100 feet higher, and there are no marked trails or access points up there, which I know for a fact because I've looked at maps plenty of times, wondering if there was a way to get up. The terrain is too dangerous. You'd also have to bushwhack through some seriously nasty stuff to reach that elevation from where I was. And yet, there was clearly someone up there. The beam would turn on, sweep across a section of the ridge, then turn off, and then a few seconds later, it would turn on again somewhere else. In that very moment, I realized listening to music was now a huge liability, so I turned the music off and listened. Whoever was up there was whistling, which sounds normal enough, but it really freaked me out. If I could hear them whistling, they would have definitely heard the music I was just playing. At that point, I was several miles into the trail. The smart thing would still have been to turn around, but I didn't want to. There was a little overlook spot up ahead that I knew about, so I told myself I'd take a break there and think things through. But as soon as I made it there, I saw something that made everything about 100 times worse. There was a stone sculpture sitting on a flat rock near the edge of the overlook. I knew what that meant. I instantly stood up, turned around, and started walking back the way I had come. But out of nowhere, I heard rapid footsteps approaching me in the direction I was walking. It was unmistakable, 100% a person's footsteps, not an animal's. I didn't even have time to think. The footsteps were so close that all I could do was hold my ground and prepare for an altercation. I didn't even have time to run, but as soon as the footsteps were right on me, they just abruptly stopped. It was really, really scary. I kept staring into the fog, but I couldn't see anything. Part of me thought whoever had just charged me was now standing still, somewhere out of my field of view, but that didn't make any sense. If I couldn't see them, how in the world did they know where I was? I waited another few seconds and then pulled out the switchblade I always kept for protection.
Excuse me.
I kept holding my ground, just waiting to see or even hear something, waiting to be attacked. But now it was just dead silence. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to announce my presence, but I was pretty sure whoever was out there already knew I was there. The thing that made it so much worse was that the footsteps had come from the direction I needed to go to get back. There was no alternate route. If I wanted to leave, I had to walk directly toward where those footsteps had come from. I tried to hold out, but I couldn't wait there forever, so I started moving. I was fully expecting to see someone eventually, at which point I don't even know what I would have done. But the further into the fog I went, the more I started thinking that whoever had been there somehow ran off without me hearing them. The paranoia was excruciating. Every few minutes or so, I swore I heard 1 or 2 extra footsteps, like someone was matching my pace from behind now. I kept looking over my shoulder, but there was nothing but fog every time. That lasted for about a mile or so. It was genuinely the most tense mile of my life. I was being stalked. I was certain of it. Out of nowhere, something crashed through the bushes somewhere behind me. It was so loud that I physically jumped. This time I couldn't control myself. I yelled something out as a pure, terrified reaction. I turned around to the spot where the noise had come from, but again, I couldn't see anything. At that point, I genuinely felt like I was going to lose my life in that forest, so I started running. I don't know why it took me so long to run, but the moment I started running, I didn't stop until I made it all the way back to my car. And the whole time, I heard crashing coming from somewhere behind me. I was definitely being chased, but I didn't care. I still consider it a miracle that I made it back to my car in one piece. I didn't hike for months after this experience, and I never got an answer for what happened that night. This happened close to 20 years ago, back when I was 15. My parents were in the midst of a really ugly divorce at the time, and my mom thought it would be a good idea for me to spend a few weeks with my great aunt Lucy in upstate Vermont while they sorted out the legal stuff. I wasn't thrilled about being shipped off to some relative I barely knew, but I didn't have much choice. Aunt Lucy lived in this massive Victorian house that had been converted into apartments sometime in the 60s. She owned the whole building and rented out the top 2 floors to tenants, while she lived alone in the sprawling first floor unit. The place was beautiful in a very specific old-fashioned way. High ceilings, original hardwood floors, intricate moldings around every doorframe, movie-type stuff like that. What struck me as odd right away was that Aunt Lucy seemed to avoid certain parts of her own apartment. She had this huge master bedroom with tall windows and beautiful antique furniture, but she slept in a small den off the living room instead. That was actually one of the things I asked her about, to which she just replied that the main bedroom got too much morning light. I then stupidly asked if I could sleep in there then, to which she glared at me disapprovingly. You gotta remember that things were a little different back then, and respecting your elders was practically law. So after that interaction, I held my tongue, not wanting to upset her further. The first few nights I was there,
I kind of don't like the
sounded
eye,
someone
but
walking around in the apartment above us. I figured it was just one of the tenants, maybe someone who worked late shifts. But the weird thing was how methodical the walking sounded, back and forth, like someone pacing the length of the apartment. After about a week of this, I couldn't keep things to myself and mentioned it to Aunt Lucy over breakfast. She again gave me this strange expression and said the second floor had been vacant for over a month. I insisted that I'd been hearing someone walking around up there every night, but she just shook her head and told me I was just hearing the building settling. Her explanation didn't make sense, but I wasn't about to argue. The next morning, I told Aunt Lucy I wanted to see the vacant apartment. She seemed reluctant, but I kept pressing, and eventually she agreed. Just like she said, the second floor was completely empty, but as we walked through the rooms together, I saw something that immediately validated what I'd been hearing. There were fresh scuff marks on the hardwood floors, like someone had been walking the same path over and over. The marks formed a clear pattern from the front of the apartment to the back, exactly matching the route the footsteps seemed to make each night. When I pointed this out, Aunt Lucy said the marks were probably from the previous tenants, but they looked too recent for that. I told her this, but she just dismissed me like I was some babbling child. That evening, she suggested we watch a movie together, which we'd never done before. As it got later, the footsteps from upstairs started up again. I looked at Aunt Lucy, expecting her to finally acknowledge what we were hearing, but instead, she just turned the volume up and pretended like nothing. I was stunned. My first thought was Aunt Lucy knew exactly what was going on and just didn't want to tell me. The next day, I called my mom and mentioned the situation, and you know what's crazy? Even my mom seemed to know what was going on. She told me not to bring up the footsteps with Aunt Lucy anymore, and that it was, quote, a sensitive topic. One night near the end of my visit, I woke up around 2 a.m. needing to use the bathroom. As I was walking back to my room, I glanced toward the staircase that led up to the second floor. The door at the bottom was slightly ajar, and I could have sworn I saw a faint light moving around up there, like someone was walking with a flashlight. I immediately went to bed and did mention it to Aunt Lucy. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. If it hadn't been for that night the two of us watched a movie, I would have assumed Aunt Lucy was causing the footsteps, but that was impossible. My mom refused to explain things to me when I got back home, and this actually caused quite the rift between the two of us. Years later, I found out through a cousin that Aunt Lucy had sold the building and moved to Florida. According to my cousin, there had been some kind of incident in the apartment back in the 90s. Someone had died there under unclear circumstances, and the family had tried to keep it quiet. That was also around the time Aunt Lucy had inherited the building. I've never believed in ghosts. I don't say that to sound dismissive or close-minded. I just genuinely don't. I think that's a pretty dumb way to interpret things you don't understand, to be frank. So when I think back on what I experienced in that house, I always find myself searching for some other explanation. Maybe Aunt Lucy was sheltering someone up there, a relative in trouble, or someone who needed to stay hidden. Or maybe she was being blackmailed, forced to let someone live in her building without anyone knowing. Maybe the incident my cousin mentioned wasn't as closed as the family wanted to believe, and whoever was responsible still had some kind of hold over her. Or maybe the entire thing was completely made up, and my cousin was needlessly gossiping. I really don't know. What I do know is that my mom knows something, and I'll never forgive her for withholding that information from me. I think this is just one of those things that will never have an explanation.
Alright. I'm gonna go now. Damn, it's 1:14? Jesus Christ. Yeah, I'm gonna go. I got a lot of work done. I'm actually happy how this came out. I'm really surprised how well it came out. What game is this? Okay, I'm gonna send you guys over to a friend of mine. Thank you for watching my stream. I hope you guys have a good day or night, and have a good day at work if you're there currently or you have to go. Right, you guys stay well, stay healthy, stay blessed, and thank you for watching my stream. I guess I should kind of talk about what this is before I go. Yeah, this is I wanted to make a VTuber, so I've tried so many VTubers, create your own character and stuff, and it's just like they never have like what I'm looking for. And I've just been kind of lazy about like making my own VTuber, so I was like, ugh. Then I was like, I have a Cintiq and everything, you know, I should actually try and make something of my own. So here we are. Yeah, it's just like I never liked the design of what people make, and you know, it's kind of like now I'm like kind of like Thanos, so it's just like I guess I'll do it my damn self. So here we are. All right, you guys have a nice night. All right, bye. Oi. Da 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 da. Ah, stretch it. I thought I would do it already.